Morning, everyone. Welcome to Governance and Audit and Standards Committee meeting. I'm Councillor Will Purvis, Chair of the committee. A few little quick housekeeping points. If the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate by the stairwells. Don't use the lifts. The meeting point is the Queen Victoria statue in the civic offices. And if you signed in, please remember to sign out. The meeting is obviously being live streamed from a camera affixed location at the back. It mainly catches the back of people's heads if you make a deputation, but it may capture you walking up or back down if you haven't. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting as long as it doesn't disrupt the meeting. Can I ask everyone to use the microphone so that it is recorded and streamed as well. And if we just quickly go round to my left and people introduce themselves.
I'm Ian Lyon, Councillor for Nelson Ward.
I'm Julian Pike, Deputy Director of Finance.
David White, External Audit Manager for Ernst & Young.
Paul Somerset, Deputy Chief Internal Auditor.
Elizabeth Goodwin, Chief Internal Auditor.
John Bell, Director of Human Resources, Legal and Performance.
Michael Lawther, Deputy Chief Executive.
Vicky Pleathouse, Democratic Services.
Okay, I've had apologies for absence from Councillors Bosher, Elcombe and Ferret.
Also from Helen Thompson, our External Auditor, Chair.
Okay. Declarations of members' interest. Do any members have... yeah, you know what I mean.
Reference item 7, report on Hampshire Community Bank. There are two things which are perhaps relevant, neither of which is a financial interest. One is that I seconded the proposal to invest in this in 2014, and secondly that I remain, as I was then, a Director of the Hampshire Credit Union, currently trading as Wessex Community Bank.
Thank you. Any other deputations? Any other declarations of interest?
I don't think so.
Okay. We have received 2 requests for deputations. As in the past, I'm suggesting we take those now at the beginning of the meeting, if that's okay. Both deputation requests are from Mr. Jerry Brown, one on item 6 and one on item 7. Mr. Brown, if you'd like to make your deputations.
So the first is on agenda item 6, which is the performance management update. It's really great to have the performance reports, right? They're really getting to be pretty good. But they form part of a reports pack that is 312 pages long. All right, 311, right? It's an awful lot of data for members who aren't full-time employees to try and assimilate and build sensible questions about. What we could really do with are summaries of each of the reports, 1 page each, all in the same format, provided as an executive report at the beginning of the report pack, not to replace what's there, but in addition. These should be some simple dialogue about what's changed, the current position, risk, financial implication, and recommended actions. Now, I'm more than certain that templates for such summaries abound, and if implemented, this could help the meeting to focus on areas that perhaps needed more attention than others. The expected response will be officers don't have the time to do this, to which my answer would be, so we're going to force every single councillor to read it all by themselves and build their own summaries then, are we? In the same vein, it's non-trivial, I would suggest, for members to try and track actions from one governance audit and standards meeting to another, apart from reading the minutes. What we need is a simple tracking spreadsheet, and I've written one, and I'm going to send it in at the end of the meeting. At least it would be an improvement on that which doesn't exist today. And my example is populated with some of the actions from the last meeting and the meeting before that and the meeting before that, which includes a detail on how the breach of data protection had happened and would report back to this committee. And again, the city solicitor said that the greater concern was a lack of proper contract being in place, and he'd look at all the issues raised and would report back to members of the committee by way of an explanatory note before the next meeting. Now, that was in July. And also that he agreed to check the redress available where an employee's data had been breached, and confirmation was given with regard to the GDPR issue regarding legacy systems, this was underway and an update will be provided to this committee at a future meeting. This is all from July or June. But I didn't see any of this stuff on the agenda, and here we are in the middle of September. What's the process? What happens if it doesn't get done? Do we just hold our hands up and say, oh, well? So if actions aren't reported on at this meeting, then how do they get carried over? Where is the tracking spreadsheet? So here's my example. It's simple. It's in Excel. It's got the date, who's going to do it, what they're going to do, how we're going to know it's complete, and we can look at that every meeting and then we know we haven't dropped anything. I think it was Councillor Lyon that said that when someone agreed to report back to the committee, they should also say exactly what they were going to report back and specifically what needs to be fed back. And Councillor Bosher then said that there was quite a lot in the previous minutes from June and May, especially actions on the city solicitor, but that he wasn't present at that meeting. And the chair of the meeting, Councillor Purvis, then said that the promised explanatory note would be delivered within 2 weeks. Well, has it been delivered? And if not, then where is it? And if it has been delivered, then why hasn't it been published to the public like it should be in the notes for the meeting? Councillor Mason said that things referred to in the meetings disappear. Completely, I agree with him, and they need to be recorded. So has all this happened, and where is the promised note from the Scrutiny Management Committee? Because I haven't seen that either. I'd be more than delighted to find out that there already exists a tracking system for actions in governance, audit and standards, but I'd ask that that tracking system be made public. I know I'm nearly there. Right? Frankly, I don't care what mechanism we use. You can use my spreadsheet if there's nothing else, as long as there's something published every month to show us the status. Otherwise, we become like a Samuel Beckett character. I'm like that. Either I forget right away, or I never forget. So thank you for listening to me. That's the end of the deputation on agenda item 6. Now the deputation on agenda item 7, Hampshire Community Bonk. Oh dear, what can the matter be? HCB is locked in a lavatory and nobody knew. Well, that's not true, is it? I mean, governance, audit and standards is actually rather more like Vladimir and Estragon. We always find something to give us the impression that we exist. But sadly, for HCP Bonk, that is not the question. What are we doing here? That's the question. So this has been dragging on and on and on, and HCB was intended to get its full banking licence in 2016. And yet here we are, 2 years later, no banking licence. It's the bonk with no bank. The essential doesn't change. I understand that there was a funding shortfall following the 2015 election, and it's unlikely now to get a banking licence before 2020, only 4 years late. Tomorrow, when I wake or think I do, what shall I say of today that with governance, audit and standards, my friends, at this place, until the fall of night I waited for the HCB banking licence. So I think we should be clear about knowing exactly what the ownership and management structure of the bank is and its parent company. Who owns what proportion of the business and why is that so? And this could be usefully demonstrated in an organogram. Establishing the bank requires the appointment of key personnel, so where does the money come from? The bonk has already purchased a property in Winchester, but has now seen somewhere else it likes and will be moving there. How much will this cost? Will the bonk make more from the sale than the cost of the replacement premises? Can we see the costs of the establishment of the entities, including people, premises, legal costs and other disbursements, set against the investment stream and profitability? And is there a period of time when we're in the red with HCB and its associated companies? And who approves all the costs associated with the HCB bonk project? And where is the risk register and the project plan? And lastly, you might want to ask yourself a couple of rhetorical questions. How is it that the £1 million loan book exists when the money which came from the Regional Growth Fund was administered by the local First CIC and Eastleigh Borough Council was the accountable body? And since the bonk has no licence, how are the salaries of the officers who have been appointed being paid, or are they unpaid voluntary posts, in which case do valid employment contracts exist and can they without payment? What is the succession planning for the bonk should Professor Werner fall under a bus? And since the City of Portsmouth has invested almost 2/3 of the £8 million investments, what have been the benefits so far for the Portsmouth economy? It's £5 million that we've put in. So just when will HCP put the bank in bonk, or is HCB still locked in the Gary? And to close as I opened, still with Vladimir and Estragon waiting and waiting, he didn't say for sure that we'd have a licence by 2019. And if we don't get one, well, we'll come back the next year. And then the year after that, possibly. And so on. The point is, until we get the licence. You're merciless. We came here last year. And I was going to say, and now over to Chris to actually go and explain what HCB is all about. And to do his Lionel Richie impersonation with "Hello, is it me you're looking for?" when actually, no, it's a packet of Werner's Originals that we're seeking. That's the end of the deputation on agenda item 7, HCB Bank.
Thank you. Just as we move on to minutes from the July meeting, it probably is worth pointing out we do have an action sheet tracker here, which has arisen from... Do you have copies of them? It did go out by email. I don't know what date. Let's have a... Yeah. So perhaps we'll run through that in association with this point on the minutes. I know Michael did circulate a note on the 16th of August in response to the June minutes, because we noted at the July one.
If I may interrupt, can we just have 2 minutes to read this, because actually I think it might impact on some of the comments we might have had, or I might have had, on the minutes themselves. So,
Absolutely.
if I may, thank you.
Yes, MP one came yesterday afternoon. Michael's one came on the 16th of August, and I think the tracker sheet came on... I'm trying to find where it's gone. The 11th? Yes, the 11th of September. Luckily for my sins, I'm not on that one as well. I might pass on that.
Can I just say, it would have been helpful to have had this information earlier than yesterday, given that we've been asked to read. It is 312 pages. I've missed out the last page somehow. And that this would have helped to inform a little. I don't know why it's taken till yesterday for these two submissions to come to us.
Chairman, can I suggest that we build this into the timetable in future, and we say that perhaps we get it out 10 working days before the committee meeting?
I would suggest actually 3 working days before the chairman's review.
The briefing.
Fine.
Briefing.
Yep.
So
we'll work
actually
to that.
it can be informed.
So
It can
we
inform
discussed
us.
the briefing.
Yeah.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely, fine.
And as an,
If we could minute that, that'd be great.
yeah, as an additional note, perhaps that where updates are requested by email, they should be published alongside the minutes.
Yep, we'll do that from this meeting on. Yep.
Thank you. are we happy to proceed with the minutes from the last meeting on this action sheet?
I must say, Chairman, I do not recall receiving this action sheet, and I find it very interesting when referring to the annual government statement that a report was emailed circulated past tense to committee 13th of September.
Suggestion that this postdates that circulation of yesterday.
I think the updated version does, as opposed to the original version, but yes. So on to the minutes. Do we want to, any comments on the accuracy of the minutes? Perhaps then we run through the action sheet as part of that to check.
Well, there's clarifications in them, yes. So could I go to page 7 of the pack and page 3 of the minutes? About 3 paragraphs up from the bottom. We talk in relation to minute 35, page 4, bullet point 5. Further clarity was requested about MMD and the Treasury Management Strategy and how MMD loans are accounted for. Mr. Ward agreed to provide a written response. It didn't actually say at the time when that would happen. I gather it has since happened, although I haven't seen it. Basically, I had quite a lot of reading and stuff to do this week, but I was hoping that it would have arrived earlier than it did, and I gather from our action sheet that half of it has been done, which is where the money has been accounted for, but actually I'm really interested in how it's been spent, why it was spent, and what has actually been achieved from it, and I suspect the answer in all cases is unsatisfactory.
Yep, so I think we were discussing this on the way over, actually. Yeah, the first part of that, there was an email from Julian.
22nd of August, that was circulated.
Yeah, on the accounting point. I did speak with them at that point, and it was clear that the detail of reports on MMD and a specific report on MMD covering all financial and audit issues wasn't going to be ready by today. So I agreed that it would be deferred, but as I said at the last meeting, and I would probably what minuted now is, I think it is sufficiently important to justify that we could do an additional meeting for that if members wanted to. We don't have another scheduled meeting till November. We could quite easily do one in October to look at the MMD if that's sufficient time to get the reports ready by then.
Yes, the problem with getting the report to this meeting was one of leave, and staff
Yeah.
are back from leave.
So if we rescheduled a special meeting in October, it would be possible to look at that.
Would it be in order for members of the committee, should they wish to send you the questions that we want answered?
See no reason why
rather than ask
we
the
can
officers
inform
to preempt what we might be thinking about? Would it be helpful? We may not get those questions answered, of course, but it would be at least nice to have asked them.
It certainly makes sense to inform what's put in that report so that it's a constructive discussion, so yes.
Chairman, shall we aim then to have an extra meeting before the end of October, bearing in mind where we are now, and it will take a few weeks to get
Yes.
papers together, members to get their questions in, responses prepared, make it meaningful by the end of October. Yep, we'll do that.
Still in the minutes, moving forward.
Yeah.
Page 9, second point, or the first bullet point, a new IT policy was about to go live. Yeah, what, where, when? What's it look like? And you know, it's an important element because we spend a lot on IT, and I'd love to know a bit more about it. This is not really good enough in terms of explaining what we discussed and how we discussed it.
Could we have a copy of the new IT policy?
Absolutely. We'll add that to the tracker.
Probably the only point to make from my perspective is I was asked to decide whether we needed to progress having an extraordinary meeting on the energy company for fairly self-explanatory reasons. I said no. So that didn't.
I think at the time I recall when we were discussing it, we were actually discussing not whether or not it was a good idea, or whether or not the policy was the right one, but actually my question was how it had been dealt with by the officers, because after all this is what GANS is about. It's about the governance of this council. My worry at the time, which was partly assuaged by the subsequent briefing, which would have been much more helpful much earlier, because I think we could have put some politics into it rather than just the commercial elements. For example, I think that one of the things that made it fall in terms of the Cabinet was that we weren't talking about fuel poverty, which we should have been. And if we had had a political element to what Vessel was intended to do, and one that demonstrated a value to our community, it might not have suffered the fate it did. And my question, therefore, was whether or not officers, when they are dealing with something as important as this, should be more informative, should include people in discussions about what it's for and how it works. And therefore it is actually about a GANS issue. It's about asking the officers whether they believe in their own, well, possibly in retrospect and hindsight, whether everything that could have been done was done, both to inform councillors and to allow a feedback through the process to make it possibly a more attractive proposition for the new administration.
Don't disagree with that. It's whether we think we need to bring a report on what the process was to get to there, or whether that's better dealt with by SNP, given that they're debating it next week.
SNP debates policy. We debate executive action, and that's the point. And I wonder whether or not we couldn't merge the MMD meeting into one that discusses Vessel as well, just how it was put together. Because these are the two companies currently owned by the council, and I think it probably would help to have both of them as exemplars in this case. So if we could make the special meeting about MMD also about the way...
Could we have a report just on how we got to that point with Vessel, not the politics of it, but literally the structure of the process?
Of how the company became established.
Yes, and the process for setting it up, etc.
And how we were informed, and how the councillors were engaged in this process, and whether there are lessons to be learned in future should we wish to have another revenue-raising scheme that we need, but that actually needs to have a political input to it and not just an executive one. You look nonplussed. So, for example, what I'm trying to say, Michael, is...
I understand. I think it might be a very, very short report.
Well, that's fine. But I think it still needs... It still warrants discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions on the minutes?
Page 12, or page 16, but 12 minutes. Again, I may have missed it, but you advise, as chair, that you'd recently received the annual letter from the Ombudsman about complaints and would email it to members of the committee. I don't remember receiving that.
Yeah,
email.
I did it during the meeting, actually.
Oh, you did during the meeting? Oh, well, probably didn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's also what's in the report today.
I have a very short-term memory.
Yeah. It's only the same table that's in the report
I think
today.
I'm due to qualify for one of the 566 places in dementia, but, very soon. Just discussed, I'm happy with the minutes.
Thank you. Okay, we're happy to agree the minutes? Agreed. So, item 4, LGO complaints annual report. So that's the thing I circulated by email, and now is the detailed report that's come through with it as well. So, morning. Over to you to introduce it.
And just, that's how it works. If I can just give you a quick summary of the content of the report. It's to bring to the attention of the committee an overview of City Council complaints, including the annual review of complaints by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, which we received in July and was discussed at the last committee meeting. Just as a bit of background, which again came up last time, the Council handled 494 corporate complaints in 17-18, and a total of 246 of those were about social care, 122 for adults and 124 for children. So just gives you a bit of context. Of the corporate complaints, 450 of those were resolved at the first stage of the complaint process. And we brought the complaint process to you last time, so you should have some recent knowledge of how that process works. 44 complaints were then taken to stage 2 of the process and 22 to stage 3. So not a high level of escalation through the process. The vast majority of our complaints are resolved at stage 1. 46 complaints were then forwarded to the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman in 17-18. That's 4 more than in 16-17, but 1 less than 15-16. So reasonably static in terms of the number of complaints that are going to the Ombudsman. We also compare well with other authorities. So our sort of neighbouring unitaries, Brighton and Hove, had 120 in the same period, and Southampton had 74. So we're not receiving a high number of complaints to the Ombudsman in comparison to other reasonably comparable local authorities. Of the 46 complaints the Ombudsman received, they only upheld 9. The remainder were either referred back to us, closed after initial inquiry, subject to advice, or simply not upheld. We've got 6 upheld complaints relating to social care and 3 that were related to planning. And as a result of those complaints, there were a number of recommendations to the Council, largely around improvements to process, things like reminding social workers that they can refer individuals to advocacy services, reminding staff about amendments to agreements being signed, those kind of sort of process changes which were made as a result. So we are learning from the feedback that we receive from complaints. There were also a variety of remedies, including obviously apologising to customers where the council was at fault and paying compensation or refunding fees in relation to planning where that was appropriate. So hopefully that gives you an overview of where our local government and social care ombudsman complaints is. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. The question I have is in the governance and audit bit is, as usual, it has no financial element to it, or no doesn't say what I'd like to see on page 21 or page 3. The decision made upheld. How much did that cost, and which departments paid for it? So, are we talking about hundreds of pounds? Are we talking about thousands of pounds? We have no financial qualitative element to it, and that tells us, as a committee, if we're dealing with millions of pounds worth of money going out and being paid, what element of that is in compensation. I'm certain it's not as much as, say, British Gas or others, but I'm also interested that you put Birmingham as a comparator. Birmingham is a huge local authority, and it has all sorts of additional issues. I could see Brighton and Hove, and I could see the point of Southampton. I'd like to see Plymouth. Plymouth is the most comparative place to Portsmouth. It's a naval port. It has some of the same social considerations, and it also is mistakenly regarded as being poor per person because people don't take into account the fact that the Navy pays for a lot of accommodation. So actually, that would be very useful, and wherever possible, where we compare any council, it seems to me we should have an outlier of Plymouth, where we have the details, as a direct comparator. Southampton is just down the road, yes, that's fine, so is Brighton. Birmingham is a little further away, and I'm still stunned and staggered that it's in there. But I presume that's the worst one in the whole country, because it's the largest authority. Well, it's nice to know, but it doesn't help me very much.
I'm sure we can circulate the details with regard to Plymouth as well after the meeting. We'll add that to our tracker, Chairman.
Yeah. But otherwise, thank you. It's useful to see, and it seems the only question one would ask is it that it's difficult to complain, and therefore we have fewer complaints, or do we think that our complaints procedure is aligned with those of others? So, for example, while we have Birmingham in our sites, is their complaints procedure more accessible than ours, or similar, or less accessible? And do we know the answer to that question? Are we actually comparing complaints procedures in the process? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we do compare our complaints process to other local authorities, and we did a degree of research in putting that process together. We also, like all local authorities, we make sure that our complaint process is approved by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, so that they are happy with the process that we are following and it is appropriately accessible to our customers. Our customers have multiple ways to complain to us, including in person, online, through a paper form that we make available in our public offices, and we're in the process of making that form even more accessible at the moment. So yes, I think our customers do have adequate means to complain, and yes, we do compare to other local authorities to make sure we're doing all that we can. I think we're really clear that what we want is for, if a customer has a complaint, then we do want to hear that, because it's an opportunity for us to learn and, in theory, to improve and to make our services better.
Two questions. We had 494 complaints this year. How does that compare with previous years, the number of stage 1 complaints? Second question is that concerning the material which went to the Ombudsman, 15 were referred back to for local resolution. Presumably they went to the Ombudsman because we were unable to resolve them at local level, and they are referred back to us. So how do you handle that process, and what is the outcome like in those 15?
On the number of stage 1 complaints from 16-17, I don't have that information with me, so if I may, I'll provide that to the committee after the meeting. On the complaints that are referred back to us from the Ombudsman would normally expect somebody complaining to them to have followed our complaint process in the first place, and they do receive a number of complaints from customers who haven't actually been through our complaint process. So those 15 will refer to people who haven't been through our process, and therefore the Ombudsman have sent them back and said, actually, you need to come back to the council and complain to the council in the first place. I don't know whether any of those 15 then doubled back and ended up with the Ombudsman. I could try and find that out. But that's what those 15 refer to.
So they are people who did not either know the process or willfully ignored the process and went straight to the Ombudsman?
That would be my understanding, yes.
Right. Thank you.
If I may assist, very occasionally what will happen is there will be a difference of opinion between us and the members of the community. It does happen. When it goes to the Ombudsman, occasionally the Ombudsman will say, yes, I understand what the local authority is saying, but I think this is the way in which it should be dealt with. So sometimes it will come back to us through that route as well. We'll be effectively given guidance or an indication that it's something which we should try to resolve locally, and it'll come into that loop. I think it might be helpful also if we could allay Councillor Lyon's fears with regard to enormous costs and liabilities falling in the part of the council, because I think you have set out in the report the extent of the local. Sorry. Yeah, I think the costs are very, very low. In fact, as a could perhaps Charlotte help, Chairman, on this?
The costs that we've, where we know what the costs were, we've set them out in the report. That initial one from adult social care, I don't know at this point what that cost was, but again, I can find out. But as you can see, the pattern is it's very low amounts of compensation that are paid.
Sorry, Chairman. I was wondering, then, can we have a register of what is actually paid in respect of complaints from whatever quarter, so we know? I mean, it makes sense to centralise that process where possible.
Chairman, we happily add that to the list and complete that register. The awards which are made by the Ombudsman tend to be in the hundreds of pounds. And I think you've almost got the full extent of the costs to the council in respect of penalties. Obviously, dealing with complaints is more expensive. There is a 3-tier process. It involves everyone right up to the Chief Executive and myself. And obviously, that's an expensive process, which is why we try to resolve complaints as early as possible within our process. And as my colleagues have mentioned, of course, the process is one which we do pass by the Ombudsman for the Ombudsman's approval to ensure that we're following as good and open a process as we can.
Which leads finally to my final question here, which presumably, if one should take the Laffer curve, the famous Laffer curve, there must be a point at which, even if it looks slightly spurious as a complaint, knowing that it's going to cost hundreds of pounds to pursue it and deal with it, might it not be better to have a policy of presumed liability, even if we don't have it, simply to avoid those costs? Because I know that might mean that other people will suddenly have a whole range of complaints, but it does seem to me that if we're only dealing with a few £100, a maximum, and occasionally sort of 100, just an hour of your time must be at least 350.
I'd like to rest assured it's £100. What we try to do, in effect we do, because what we try to resolve is resolve the complaints at the first and earliest stage possible when they're a service complaint. A matter such as if somebody says their bin hasn't been collected, we don't get into an argument, discussion about that. We send somebody out to try and collect the bin and deal with it in that particular way. So we are quite pragmatic. The complaints which tend to come into the system, as they would here, are ones where we haven't been able to resolve them in another way. And then we have to be quite sensible. This is public money, and we would be reluctant to give people compensation if there isn't a fault or something which we could have done better. But we do try to resolve complaints before they enter this particular part of the process. So yes, we do that. It is a matter of judgment. Very much aware of the fact that processing and dealing with complaints is an expensive process, but also we do get a number of complaints from people which have absolutely no foundation, unfortunately.
May I just interrupt me at this point, which is that it occurs to me that having read all these reports we've read, the big ones are children's and adult services, and we don't have anybody from those departments here, and I'm pretty certain, no matter how omniscient the people here are, that there are certain questions that have arisen from them that we need to ask a senior person in each of those departments face to face. And I'm wondering whether there's an availability for them to attend the meeting. I know it's late, there's short notice, but actually there's an immense amount of stuff and it's really important.
Chairman, in respect of children's services, that's not possible today because there's an Ofsted inspection underway and they're getting feedback on that this morning. I think it's important that they attend those meetings with Ofsted. In respect of adults, we will see what we can do, I think is the answer, but it's quite difficult at short notice. Sorry? Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, we'll try to provide somebody.
Unless there's any more questions on LGO complaints. External Auditor's Annual Audit Letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So our paper for the meeting today is our annual audit letter with regard to our 2017-18 audit of the Council. The annual audit letter is a requirement of the Accounts and Audit Regulations for us to provide and for the authority to publish it on its website. It effectively communicates the results of the 2017-18 audit, and therefore it is really giving you the same messages that you received at the July meeting in our more formal and longer audit results report. The only thing really to have changed since then is that our work was fully completed by the deadline and the opinion signed before the 31st of July. There were a number of loose ends noted in the audit results report, but there was nothing significant arising from the completion of any of the outstanding work. And as I say, the opinion was issued on the 30th of July ahead of the deadline. The one thing to be fully completed since the last meeting was our work on the Council's whole of government accounts submission, which is a separate submission that the Council makes to allow for the consolidation of the accounts at department and whole of government level, but effectively contains the same figures as the financial statements. That's subject to a separate deadline of the 31st of August. That work was completed with no issues arising, and the WGA submission therefore went in, and our certificate confirming formal closure of the audit was signed on the 10th of August. Other than that, the findings communicated in the annual audit letter are, as I say, the same as those that you'll have seen previously in the audit results report. And in summary, our opinion on the statements for 17-18 was unqualified, as was our value for money conclusion. There were no other issues of significance arising, and we were not required to do anything under our wider powers under the Local Audit and Accountability Act. I wasn't really proposing to go through the report in any great detail because, as I say, it contains the same findings that you'll have seen previously, but I'd be happy to take any questions, and anything that I can't answer, I'll refer to Helen, and we can provide a response in writing afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And could you pass on my personal congratulations to your team for having completed it in the time that you were asked to? I know I gave Helen a hard time a couple of years ago, but I think that we probably made up, if not quite kissed yet.
Thank you.
If we go on to page 21 of your report, which is page 47 of the letter, I tend to try to look for the most obscure things. If I don't understand them, I suspect it's because you don't want me to. So I'm looking at IFRS 9 financial instruments, which is where you talk about an issue and the impact. And on the next page, you talk about IFRS 16 leases. Well, if I can just take you to the first one, I would very much appreciate a short explanation of it, where the reclassifying existing financial instruments assets and what that actually means. Does that mean? Anyway, well, I can ask you that. And the second is impact on the leases. Yet again, that wonderful institution MMD raises its head because we lease one or two cranes, and no one's actually been able to explain it. There is one there, but I think we do lease them 2 cranes. I don't know what's happened to the second one, but someone might be able to explain that one day. So we bought it, we're leasing it. I'm assuming that IFRS 16 will look at that in a different light, unless I've got it entirely wrong, and we're just talking about leasing vehicles or something. So could you please just clarify those points for me? Well, clarify is butter, isn't it? Make it clear to me what those points are. Thank you.
I'll attempt to. I might look across at Julian for a little bit of help on some of this as well, potentially. But IFRS 9 financial instruments. So a financial instrument can really be anything that gives rise to a right to receive or pay cash. So it's a very broad definition, but it does exclude things that arise as a result of statute. So it's a contractual obligation. And effectively, the new standard...
Could you just give me an example of the difference, the two?
So the council has a range of debtors and creditors on its balance sheet. Some of those will arise as a result of a contract with a third party. Others are as a result of something that's statutory, so things to do with business rates, council tax, etc., would probably come under the second heading and therefore would not be financial instruments. But it's loans and borrowings and things of that nature as well. And any equity holdings, and that sort of thing. As I understand it, the new standard removes some of the classifications of financial instruments, and it is quite complex, which exist in the current standards. And the potential impact is that the way in which some of them are required to be valued will change, and they're required to be valued on a fair value basis, and that movements in the fair value of those instruments could impact the bottom line of the council's accounts. But that would be new and different. But that said, there is still consideration, as I understand it, being given to some kind of statutory override, which would mean that although you would have to account for those changes in value, they would then be written out and not impact on the bottom line of the accounts. They'd go out through the movement in reserve statement, as does so much else in local government accounting. Julian, I didn't know if you wanted to...
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that was to say the reason why that adjustment gets made, and it's to reduce the volatility of changes in the value of these assets on the taxpayer. Otherwise, there'd be large ups and downs in the charges we'd have to make to the taxpayer in order to account for these losses or increases in the value of these assets. And that's why the government says we can make these statutory adjustments.
Well, I would understand if we were dealing with the stock market and we actually had sensible equity investments in something like that. And I suspect that, yet again, MMD comes into this because it must be involved financial instruments. We must be having to revalue them, and on what I would consider a fair basis is probably considerably less than it currently stands in our accounts in terms of what the sale value of that business is, for example, which I imagine is what you're talking about.
Possibly. As I say, this is... I realise this is a slightly unsatisfactory answer, but it is still an emerging area where there is further guidance to be forthcoming, and there is an awareness, I think, that whilst these standards need to be implemented and that they have a greater bearing on private entities, and that there is a need to try to mitigate any kind of large ups and downs and how those could impact on the council taxpayer.
in MOD's case, it's one large down and no large ups is all.
For IFRS 16 leases, the key thing there, I think, is that at the moment there are two main classifications of lease: a finance lease and an operating lease. And under an operating lease, you do not hold the asset on your own balance sheet because the risks and rewards of the ownership of the asset are not judged to have transferred to the council in this instance. Whereas under a finance lease, you would. This is for assets that you are leasing in. Under the new standard, most of that sort of goes away, and in the vast majority of cases, if you are leasing something in, you would be showing the asset on your own balance sheet. So the key consideration would be to look at what is currently shown as an operating lease that you have coming in, and to consider whether that should then result in an asset on your balance sheet as and when this standard gets implemented. But this one is a slightly further into the future consideration in that it's not to be implemented until 1920 as it currently stands. And again, there is consideration being given as to whether there would be a need for any form of statutory override for local authorities to exempt them from any of the requirements, which is yet to be confirmed, as I understand it.
Well, what about leases out, where, for example, we do have these cranes? They're on our balance sheet. They must be, I'm assuming somewhere. I mean, I challenge anyone to find them, probably even the finance director. But anyway, we don't know where they are. But it's a finance lease out. It's an operating lease. So the question is, are we now going to transfer that out of our balance sheet under these rules, whether or not they've got to state that something changes? But in principle, are we saying that anything we lease to somebody else and then they have an operating lease on it now goes onto their balance sheet and off ours?
Chair, if I was going to clarify the cranes point, in the note I circulated in August, we refer to it's actually three cranes that we're leasing to MMD at the moment. And they are, interesting enough, they're currently treated as operating leases out. So what we've done is we've acquired the three cranes. Those cranes currently are shown on our balance sheet at their value to the council, but we've got an operating lease in place where MMD pay us an annual leasing charge or contribution for the use of those assets. But as David has alluded, under the changes that will be coming forward in the future, those assets will be removed from our balance sheet and will be appearing on MMDs in the future with the implementation of this new standard.
Does that mean that we're giving them yet more money?
No, it doesn't. In fact, they're giving us money for the use of the cranes.
Chairman, I think it would be useful if that statement could be expanded upon at our special meeting in October.
Absolutely. I look forward to finding out far more about IFRS than I ever wanted to.
Excuse me, Chair, would it be helpful if I recirculated my note from August back round members? Shall I do that after this meeting? Okay.
Any other questions, comments on the external auditor's annual audit letter? No, I think we covered it in some detail last time. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Quarterly performance management update.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll introduce this one if I may. I mean, obviously, I don't need to say too much about the report itself, given it's one that members are very familiar with. I think, I mean, as has been said many times, including by Mr. Brown in his colourful deputation, there is certainly a large amount of information in there. I think what I would say is that in response to members' comments previously, we have included at Appendix 1 a summary of the performance issues in respect of each directorate, which I would hope would at least in part answer the questions that have been, or the comments that have been raised about volume and content. I mean, there are obviously a number of appendices, of which the summary is just one, and the other appendices contain the much more detailed performance report in Appendix 2, and in Appendix 3, projects, and Appendix 4, risks. And obviously, I mean, if members have had a chance to go through all that, firstly, well done, and secondly, obviously, I'll deal with whatever sort of questions and comments may come up on the back of that, and if they're not areas that are within my sort of personal knowledge or that of other people around the table, we can certainly go away and provide written responses to those. I have, in response to Councillor Lyon's comment a few minutes ago, emailed someone in adult social care who are busily scurrying around trying to find someone who'd be keen to come along and deal with any questions on that front. So hopefully there will be someone arriving sort of in due course, or if not, once again, I can pick up any questions and get written responses back to members. The only other thing I guess I would draw attention to is, I mean, in the paragraphs under, I guess, 3.5 down to 3.7, and we have tried to sort of highlight members' attention on the particular cross-cutting themes in the report. I think in some respects, I mean, that does feel a bit like sort of stating the blazing obvious, and that clearly, I mean, those recurring themes are that we're having increasing demands on services, there's reducing amounts of capacity to deal with those, and that's obviously exacerbated and to a large extent caused by the ongoing financial pressures. And yes, I mean, that is clearly stating the obvious, but the reality is that's kind of where we are as an organisation, and I think it's only right that that's highlighted and brought to members' attention. So I think that's probably all I need to say by way of introduction, but obviously we'll deal with any questions that members may have.
Thank you. Should we dive into it?
Yes, if we may. I have numerous questions about the actual report itself. I mean, the appendices. The 3.3, though, of your actual, the beginning bit. I've already spoken to the city solicitor about this, but we did have certainly an idea that it would be sensible to have other people marking other people's homework. Bear in mind, governance, audit and standards is looking at the performance of officers of the council. We're not dealing with policy, we're dealing with how officers have performed. And I'm not comfortable with people marking their own homework. I think there's no evidence this has gone through the Chief Executive's office. It may have gone through the Deputy Chief Executive's office. It's a very long report, and I know they've got lots of other things to do. But this, to me, if I were looking at it as a Chief Executive, is my way of understanding what my directors think are the main issues arising from what their day-to-day job is. I still don't see quite what keeps people awake at night, which is what I also want to see. I want to see, what their main worry is. I don't see financial implications. And what's very interesting in your 3.5, 3.6, 3.7 is you talk about the three elements that I think are absolutely key to the way that the council produces services: demand, capacity, financial challenge. But in the reports themselves, there's nothing that actually allocates them to each of those categories. For example, children's services may well be overspent through demand. We can't necessarily budget for what's going to happen. We don't know that 13 extra families are going to come into the city and all of them need help. So it's one of those things that's demand-led. And from the director's point of view, they know that. We probably know it. But in terms of detailing why it's an issue and why actually the kind of money that's being overspent I think in children's is 9 million and in adults is 3 million, is an existential threat to this council's ability to operate. It would wipe out our reserves in 2 years if we didn't have any contingency. So actually it's a seriously elemental problem, and one of the things I would be asking as a sort of result, and if it were a report, I would expect a headmaster's report at the top to say, we are worried about this and we are looking at ways, no matter how drastic, of reducing costs in other services to make sure our statutory ones are fully funded. I would be saying, wow, we've got £12 million that we weren't expecting to spend. We don't have a £12 million surplus running for the next 5 years. We haven't got £60 million in reserves, but if you were to forward plan that, effectively somebody has to say, well, how do we save that money? And is there a process? It's not a political decision, although obviously the answer would be political, but the suggestions must come from officers, and there's absolutely no sense that I get from this report that anybody is sitting there going, cripes, what happens if? And I want to see that. I want to see what our contingency plans are in the event that our children's services, adult services, continue to overrun. We don't get the funding we need from elsewhere. I'm also wondering, because I know a little bit about early intervention and something called PAIRS, which is Parent and Infant Relationship Service, which actually deals with infants. There's nothing in here about infants and the effect on infants of bad parenting at an early stage, something that is absolutely key to making sure that we don't have disruptive children going through from 5 to 16 and then into prison thereafter. There's nothing here that tells me that there's a strategy for mental health at the very early age. Now, this is something that the 1001 days people know about that has no impact at all in these reports. And I'm wondering whether A, it's being considered, B, we've decided we don't have the money to put into effect, but it's absolutely, I think it's vital. I mean, just not even focusing on it at all means that our children's services are going from 5 to 16, 18, our adults are going from 18 to whatever, and we would look at the parent, the mother or the father, but particularly the mother, when dealing with an infant's problems. But there's nothing that tells me we're doing from 0 to 5 in mental health services. And that also worries me, because it means that in future we're going to have to be spending more and more money dealing with the problems that have arisen from early stage that we're not actually addressing. So that's the overview. Is my concern that there's absolutely nothing here which tells us that we know we've got a problem, and unless I've misread this, we've got a £12 million deficit staring us in the face at the moment on what we'd expect to spend in 2018-19. We don't have that in contingency, and we don't have enough reserves for the next 2 years or 3 years to sustain that level of overspend. So what is happening, and who's doing what about it, and where do we get any kind of...
So there's probably two separate questions here. One is the financial risk point. I'm not looking over there for a response in a sec, but in terms of priorities for infant spend or otherwise, I have fairly strong views on that and agree, but that's straying firmly into a policy decision about how and where we target the spending. I think today we're concerned with what the financial risk is to the council of that. So it'd be useful to get an insight into what it means for contingency.
Yeah, I think the first point to make is, I think I would echo many of the points that Councillor Lyon is making. The overspend is actually 5 million within adult social care and 5 million within children's and 3 million within adult social care. So the combined forecast overspend of the two at the moment is 8, although that's at the end of June. There is a report going to Cabinet on the 9th of October which is reporting the Q1 forecast outturn position, which is where the adults and children's positions will be formally reported. The report does say that is a significant area of concern for the council and will need to be addressed in the medium term. Adults have a medium term plan in place, which, provided they deliver the savings that they're expecting to generate under that savings plan, will bring their budget back into balance by 2021, and there is a plan in place to manage that through the use of adult social care reserves. Children's are in the process of formulating their plan, but I think the point that the Section 151 officer will be drawing out as part of the report in Q1 is the children's recovery plan to recover the deficit is not as well developed as the adult social care plan is. In the event that the children's social care recovery plan is unable to achieve the level of savings that are required, we would be looking to increase the council's 3-year savings target that will come forward as part of the medium-term financial strategy review, which will be considered by City Council in February.
Thank you. I mean, that sounds reassuringly vague, but in essence, I have been sitting on this council for 3 years, and we have never, ever got our children's and adults' budget right. We've always underestimated it by something like 25 to 30%. year in, year out. And the question I ask is why it is that we do that. Why don't we just assume it's going to be more and be pleasantly surprised when it's less? Because what that means is the council as a whole is running up against a continual deficit that we pretend we didn't know might happen, and we're always struggling to explain to people why their services have to be cut, because actually the statutory services have to be funded on demand. This is the other thing I was talking about in terms of the appendices. It's important to know why we have to spend money as opposed to where we want to spend money. So, we don't get that either in these reports. It's children's services we know is a statutory requirement. Let us know that it's a statutory requirement in here, but also when we have, for want of a better word, and please excuse me my phraseology, vanity projects, they need to be shown as vanity projects, and they could be cut. They could be removed if we need to fund statutory services. There is no element here throughout this report of what our priorities are and what we have to do, what we should do, and what we shouldn't, or what we might not notice if we didn't do it. And I think that's part of our issue here. And I know it's a tricky problem, but actually in the summary that Mr. Brown was referring to, I mean, I did think we had sort of executive summaries, but we don't actually have a qualitative judgment on what is happening in the council in terms of money being spent, what we expect our overrun to be, and how we are going to address it. I mean, thank you, Julian, for your explanation. But what we're then doing is catching up. We're never in advance. We're always saying, oh, we didn't know we were going to have to spend an extra 5 million here or an extra 3.5 million there. Why not? Why don't we just incorporate it? And if we happen to have money for vanity projects, do it next year, because we managed to save the money in the year that we're talking about. But it seems to me we are making budgets that are never, ever right. They're never realistic. And ultimately, we're always trying to catch up and cut things that we've said to people we're going to do. Much easier not to tell them we're going to do in the first place, then we won't be cutting them.
Chairman, I do think it would be extremely helpful if members actually perhaps had a briefing from adults and children's services as the difficulties, particular difficulties which they've had this year. Only this week we had a very large number of unaccompanied asylum seekers, children who arrived at our port. And that is not something which we... That's children's. It turned out some were adults, but it was a children's problems initially. And it was a large number of children which suddenly had to be dealt with. And there is also, whilst we do budget, and we at the end of the day produce balanced budgets, the Council isn't running into a deficit situation, we're not in a dire financial situation by any means that many local authorities are in the country, we're in a healthy financial state. But it is difficult, there is a massive growth in the need for adult social care. And I'm not really in a position to explain to members why that continues to increase exponentially, but I think a paper or a presentation from adults and children individually would be extremely helpful. I wouldn't like the suggestion to be made that this is something which we're not trying to deal with and not trying to manage. We are. A lot of resources are being put into this in both adults and children. And when the budgets exceed the expectations which we have, as they have done year on year because of the number of older people we have in our community and the increased demands which all local authorities in the country are facing in trying to deal with that, we do provide additional funds. And yes, there are projects which we can, I wouldn't suggest they're vanity projects, but there are projects which perhaps we can set aside and we can delay, and those are the ones which which are delayed year on year. But I think perhaps it might be useful so the context in which the Council is operating could be more clearly understood.
Can I suggest a way forward? Considering we've already flagged the fact that for very justifiable reasons, children's services people can't be here today. We haven't got adult social services here today at the moment. Would it be sensible to say now that we get them to do a briefing on the 19th of October when we have our normal briefing anyway, and bear that in mind when we're looking at these, that there may be things that we can't get an answer for today, but we can ask those questions and have a proper discussion on the 19th and understand the challenges much better that way.
Chairman, I completely agree, and I have no qualms or quibbles about the idea that we have demand-led services. That's not the issue. What I'm concerned about is, as a council, I would prefer next February not to be saying, If we had known what we know now, I wish we hadn't spent that money on that. I wish we'd actually delayed it. What I'm saying is it's about planning, and I'm sure planning happens, I'm sure resources happen, but it seems to be reactive rather than proactive. And yes, I also accept that there are circumstances when we suddenly have a spurt of spending because of such things as immigration issues. But again, I would say, yes, I accept that if it happened once. But we have never, in the 3 years, and I think probably 5 years before that and maybe 8 years before that, got the budget right. We've never under-budgeted for adult social services or children's. We've never done it. So it just strikes me as a sensible scheme to increase the budget automatically so that we're not trying to catch up during the year. And it's a suggestion I made way back in 2016, I suspect. And I just suspect it would be a sensible way of running the budget. Otherwise, we're just no point in passing a budget we know is wrong.
The only comment I would say to that is we do know that there's been an underlying pressure within children's social care for a number of years, and we've been carrying that pressure in previous years in contingency. And for a number of years, there has been a release from contingency at year end in order to address the overspending within children's social care. The reason why, one of the reasons why that hasn't been mainstreamed into the children's social care budget is because we were trying to ensure that we explored every opportunity to reduce expenditure in children's social care before they were giving an increase to their base budget.
Okay, I think it's something we need to take into the budget process that's coming at the moment anyway, given that we will be signing off a new budget in February. Just putting us back slightly to the quarterly performance management update, do we want to go into specific performance issues, bearing in mind that caveat that actually it probably makes sense that if they relate to children's or adult, we might want to flag them now, but might not get answers now and discuss them at the briefing that's going to be done?
I do have a few things that actually aren't, I don't think, that are outside the qualifications. Page 63, in Appendix 1, talks about IT and now started to transform the network and application architecture for the whole council. That's an extremely interesting statement, and it's very, very broad. I mean, how much is it going to cost for a start? And what is expected to come out of it? I mean, I don't know how we as a committee are supposed to be able to look at that and have an objective view as to whether it's a good or a bad thing to be doing. I mean, obviously somebody's decided it's a good thing, but it's officers doing it. We're looking at it and asking whether it's a good thing and whether it's cost effective, and there's nothing there except that one sentence. IT are now starting to transform the network and application architecture for the whole council. Well, given it's this IT department, and I know there are people watching the IT department who don't like what I have to say, I have no expectation it's going to work, or indeed that it's going to be cost effective, or that at the end of the day it's actually going to be a project that's worthwhile. But I may be wrong, and I would love to be proven wrong on that, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Into children's services, which is page 65, I've mentioned the number of early help plans and things. That's where I was talking about something called parent and infant relationship services, but it just doesn't seem to be there. It's not a policy thing. It is actually a question of, we're being told in this on the number of early help plans, but it doesn't say what that is, what they are, and how they are. And what and all the three-letter acronyms come in EHA. And is that an early help advisory set? I don't know. So we've got lots and lots and lots of three-letter acronyms coming in that there's no glossary for, and I don't have time to look up on the internet what anyone else might think they mean. And I'm certain that anybody from the public looking at these documents is equally nonplussed by them. I mean, I do want to say that the Children's Services Report is extremely detailed, and it's worth saying it has no cost elements to it. Bear in mind that we're talking about it overspending by 5 point something million and not 9 million. It has no costs. There's no financial implication in it at all. It doesn't tell you what it costs to have so the increase in numbers of children, I mean, so as registered as privately fostered. It doesn't say the cost of that to the council is such and such. So it doesn't tell us as councillors, as governance and audits, what the financial implications of all of these things are. And, then we could focus. If we know that someone's going to cost £2.5 million as opposed to £2,500, we can focus on them and say, OK, so what's the strategy to do something about it? What are you putting in place? That's our role, is to ask questions. But if we don't know which places to ask questions are the most sensible, we ask questions about everything, which of course will drive everyone up the wall. Including the chairman.
Follow that particular one up. On page 68, you have the reduced care periods. The trend is deteriorating. What are the cost implications of a deteriorating trend? What would it cost to do action to mitigate that? There are a whole series of questions, but mainly financial ones, which relate to these matters such as care periods, average days in care, increasing number of children returning home from care, and is that benefiting us financially? It would be useful to have that kind of information added.
Sorry, if I may interject as well, it is helpful to know. It's helpful to know that our key progress of retention of qualified social work staff is 54%. But does that mean that we have only got 54% of the staff that were actually in post 2 years ago? Or does it mean that 54% of the staff have actually had a retention incentive put in front of them? This is page 71. But if we're saying that retention is 54%, that means that 1 in 2 of the people who were in post 2 years ago, possibly within 2 years, no longer is. And that is an extraordinary... I mean, we're getting raw data, and it's good to have the raw data, but unless we actually interrogate it ourselves and think, well, what does that actually mean? We're not in a position to give our qualitative judgment as to whether it's a good or a bad thing. It seems to me that 54% retention over 2 years is terrible. And it's amber. It's amber. I mean, I'm lost for words as to, I mean, if I were running a company and I lost half my workforce in 2 years, I'd say that was pretty, and I hadn't intended to, I'd say that was pretty catastrophic. So this is what I was talking about, asking other people to rate the rags.
Chairman, would you like us to jump in and try and answer some of these points before we lose them? John will probably deal with the retention point.
Yeah, I don't know the answer in full detail, but I suppose in terms of the RAG rating, that's the rating against the baseline position, which was obviously 58%, so it's got a bit worse than 58%. I appreciate that doesn't deal with whether 58% in itself is a sort of an okay position. Turnover with social workers is high. I think that's known nationally. There's a huge demand for it. That does also include newly qualified social workers as well, who essentially go through for want of a better word, a sort of a period of assessment after qualifying, some of whom make it sort of through that and some don't, if you like. There's a post-qualification period, and inevitably turnover in that period of time tends to be higher, because they're people who, well, some of whom choose sort of not to persist with social workers profession. Some sort of don't make the grade for other reasons. So it does cover quite a large cohort of staff. But I would agree, as a turnover rate, that's high, and that's why it's flagged up as an area of priority for the service. And there are things in place to try and address that through the sort of support of those people coming in, through the assessment of them coming into the organisation, and obviously what we're doing in terms of their pay and their employment package to make sure that we're as competitive as we can be in that what is an extremely competitive market.
And the other thing, of course, it doesn't have is the number of people we're talking about. So we don't know whether it's 5 people and it's gone down by 54%, go down to 54%, or 50 people and it's gone down to 54%. And I completely get your point. Well, why don't we actually make the measure in terms of people who have have already spent 2 years in the council, for example, as the start. So instead of having a kind of global measure, we say the people that we're interested in are not those who've newly qualified, who may be going somewhere else and they're just doing a year's work here, but the people who've been 2 years working for the council already have passed their employment rights process. How many of them, within 2 years, beyond that, have then shuffled off our mortal coil into somebody else's or into some other activity? So I suppose what I'm trying to do is make these figures more qualitative, and where there is quantity, at least we explain what a percentage is. Because percentages can be anything. Actual people is what we're looking for, and I'm interested in the actual people, the people we're looking after, the people who are working for us to look after them, etc., and not just raw statistics. Fantastic as they are, as often happens, more and more detail produces more and more questions.
Chairman, I mean, this is a difficulty which we have with this report. The report is very long at the moment. We could flesh it out, or try to, with providing additional information. It will become longer, and I think it will actually beckon more questions to be asked. Those who have got a long memory of our difficulties in recruiting social workers will immediately know that this is an area which is it's amber, it's not red at the moment, because in the past we had enormous difficulties recruiting social workers. The city is not the easiest of places to work in from the point of view of being a social worker. There are other more rural, leafy places in Hampshire which may be more appealing to some people. We always have had a high turnover. And in the past, going back within the last decade, we had great problems recruiting our social workers. We're not in that situation at the moment at all, but they're saying, yep, there's something here we need to address. That's why it's amber. That's why it's not red. In comparison with previous trends, this isn't too bad. It is a problem which we have across the council in many areas, because we do tend to pay in the lower quartile. Therefore, that is difficult. We have areas where it is more difficult to employ people, and we can't just quite simply pay everybody more money. We haven't got that. We can't do it. Therefore, we do tend to employ quite often newer people, people who are newly qualified. That's true across all of our professions as well. Legal, finance, the same. Therefore, we will get higher turnover of people, and that's something which we manage. And on the whole, it doesn't cause too much disruption to the system. The alternative to that is to employ more people who are more highly qualified, and with the hope that we will be able to retain them for longer periods of time. We can't actually afford to do that across all of our services. We haven't got the money to do it. Therefore, they're rightly flagging this up, saying we're in a bit of a difficult situation here at the moment. We can put more information in, but how many pages do you want? It's going to be so difficult.
In this case, 58%. We'll just have the number next to it, and 54%, the number next to it. That's all I'm looking for.
We'll put these in as you mention them, yeah. And I'm sure the report will always be deficient, but we will do the best we can.
Report, but there are various things that throw up.
Still on Appendix 1, page 59, waste management. This is an area where we have it's a statutory job. We are the authority, but we have integrated some of the work with Hampshire and Southampton. It would appear that the County Council is dragging its feet and waiting for some government policy which may or may not come. And at the same period, the waste management in the city is giving great cause for concern. There's general deterioration, there is fly tipping, there are costs are being involved, many costs are being passed on to the public, and I question why we, as the governing body for this city, are not pushing for the plans to be expedited, even though there is not the long-awaited national policy.
I can't provide that information today, but I will get a note provided to members.
Right. Thank you. That's children's. Like my colleague, I've got quite a lot on children's services. There was a lot of material here which is worrying. But that's the main stuff I've got in Appendix 1. I've got other questions when we come on to Appendix 2.
Are we not already on Appendix 2?
Oh, are we?
I've got to page 75.
In which case we are. Off you go.
Page 75. Given the national press about this, I wonder whether the last element, number of fixed period exclusions from school, previously it's figured in brackets, whether these are exam related. So we exclude people from schools so that the school's exams will improve because the people who aren't good enough to pass them are somehow excluded from the school at the time. And I'm serious. I would like to know whether that is actually happening. And I think
We'll provide the answer.
well, that would be useful. The question is, are we also dealing with all schools in Portsmouth, or are we just dealing with those under the LEA?
Does it apply to academies?
That's the point. So my question is, are we...
I was going to say, having sat on ECYP for very many years, these figures are all schools because we have that responsibility around exclusions,
So
even
they are
where they are
all
academies.
schools in Portsmouth. Okay, well that's good to know, because that was one of my questions. And then at the bottom of page 76, it says school absence, both overall and persistent absence at secondary level remains above national and is rising. Fixed period exclusions are rising. Permanent exclusions remain low. My three-letter question is why? What if it is happening? What are we doing to find out why it is happening? And what process do we go through in order to explain to people like us, the councillors, or are we just saying, oh, well, that's happening, and it's a shame, or whatever? Is there actually somebody going, or I don't know, a group of people actually finding out why we're not educating our children?
Probably worth pointing out there is a scrutiny review in school attendance that's concluded in the next few weeks.
But that's scrutiny management. That's scrutiny management. So that's about policy.
Yeah. The interesting thing, the reason I was highlighting that was for your interest to say it's worth having a read of that because it highlights quite a lot that officers have been doing around attendance. You are quite right to highlight the point about academies versus LEA because that is one of the challenges highlighted, that the levers that we have available to us are somewhat limited where academies are involved. So it's worth having a look at that for context, but it's still useful to get a response to that question.
It would be useful because this is a place where we have responsibility, but we don't have the tools available to effect that responsibility because they have been removed from us under the academy programme.
Quite, it's a smaller site, but it comes up in here as well. The increased number of part-time timetables is a highlight of that.
If we could go on to page 82, commentary, all capital projects are overseen by a project board with stakeholder engagement throughout. All the projects look as though they're doing fairly well, with the exception of primary sufficiency phase 2 deliver. But I understand that we have to spend money building schools, and I imagine that the DFE produces money to help us do that. But I'm intrigued by the committee structure as how people go about working out who does the schools and all the rest of it. I mean, the cost of actually getting the process done from someone saying, wouldn't it be good to have a school here, to having one built. How much does it cost? Who audits it? When, in terms of our time and officers involved in it, and is it as necessary as that? I mean, are we getting a gold standard when we really want a silver standard? Because actually, it is so successful that it almost is. It's too successful. It sounds a strange thing to say. We need to get everything as good as possible, but not as great as possible, because great costs and good costs less. So I just wonder how this process works and what it costs the council to do it. And then page 83, my math.
Sorry, are you sort of asking how the capital process works? How we allocate?
What I'm basically saying is it looks like we construct schools by committee. So I'm wondering how much it costs us to do the process of deciding that we're going to do King Richard School or whatever, because I imagine it's expensive in terms of time, people involved, architects and everything else, and who actually runs. I know we've got somebody who runs education, and they run what schools do and what happens within them. I know we do adult social services and children's services, and whether they have access to a new home. Who decides what the new home is, how much it costs, what we're spending on it, and the process of it? Because it seems to me that in order to get from A to B, I mean, in the private sector it's pretty difficult, but in the public sector it must involve an enormous amount of committee work and time. And I'm just wondering whether we ever look at it and say we could shorten the process, or we could cut certain people out of the process because actually we don't need them to do it in every... I don't know. I'm just asking whether we look at this and say to ourselves, are we spending the best amount of time and money on the projects themselves?
Perhaps ask the part of the briefing is around the school sufficiency point, which is what this is linked to.
Would it be helpful if I just by way of an example, give an example as to how the school sufficiency programme has been put together? What happens was the educational team will put submissions up to the Department of Education's forecast of what they think their pupil numbers will be. That will start to implement grants that we then receive down from the Department of Education. They put together a very outline proposal of what they would like to do in order to meet the school places that they think that they're going to need going forward, be that at primary level or secondary level. That then gets worked up into a scheme of cost by the design team in property services. We then have an indicative cost. So that then feeds into the overall capital bid process, where the authority knows what its total capital resources are. Members are engaged in that, in setting what priorities they would like to spend their capital resources on. And an allocation is made to education in context of all the other priorities that the council has got. It's probably fair to say that that allocation is driven in a large part by the amount of grant the Department of Education passes through to the council for school places, and the authority in the past has generally passported that figure in whole and then added to it from its own resources to ensure that the children's places are met. That initial allocation is then approved by City Council in February, and then detailed schemes are then worked up from there, and there is then portfolio holder engagement that will then get to the final point where spades start to be stuck into the ground.
Thank you. But my question, I suppose, is, I'm assuming that other authorities build new schools. Did they have a process that might be, dare I say the word, outsourced in some respects? You know, I just wonder, if you look at it, somebody says, you've got that much money to spend, so we go and spend it. I remember being governor of a school once where they had £100,000 to refurbish lavatories in the summer. They didn't have, I mean, they say they spent £100,000. It didn't cost that to anybody else, but it cost that to that school because they had that money to spend. And so my question, I suppose, is when we go through this process, which seems fairly long and lugubrious, and I understand we should have internal design teams, but we have architects in the city, we have people outside the council who may be able to pitch in and give their ideas, and it seems to me we are still Fortress Portsmouth. We try to do everything in-house. We're like the Russian factory that makes a car and actually makes the bolts as well, rather than buying the bolts in from another factory that makes bolts. And just my question, I suppose, is, are we looking out? Are we going to anywhere else and saying, what do you do? How do you build a school? How do you go about the process? What is best practice? And I don't know. I'm not saying that we don't do best practice. I'm just asking whether we ever ask the question.
I think as with all capital projects, there's a bit of a sort of mixed economy in terms of in-house external provision. I mean, most of the construction work is outsourced in effect. That goes through a procurement process. Yes, we have a certain amount of internal design capacity which is used where that's cheaper to use than going externally. It's probably a question you'd have to ask of our procurement manager in terms of how that actually goes through the process of the work being commissioned. As you're well aware, in the public sector we have quite a lot of bureaucratic hoops to jump through when when procuring anything, and obviously expenditure on school capital projects is subject to the same hoops as anything else, but the majority of the construction work itself does go outside, yes, to expenditure.
So, John, I understand. I'm talking about when you got to that, that's the spades in the ground, which is Julian rightly said. He told us the process up to the spades in the ground. I'm asking about up to the spades in the ground, and I'm just saying, is it something we ever look at to say, can we do it better? Can we do it? You know, if I want to get a new kitchen, I go to wherever, and they design the kitchen because they're going to put it in. Now the question is that a process that would work? I don't know. I'm just suggesting that we should look at it.
Probably worth remembering that there's two different things here. You've talked a lot about introducing new schools, but the capacity issues for us are secondary, and any new school nowadays, thanks to the government tying our hands, is academy anyway. We're not allowed to set up new community schools, and therefore is all signed off by the Secretary of State and the DFE. And equally on the expansion point, we have no power to compel an academy to expand. So we have to really get their buy-in to do it the way they want to do it. Otherwise, we can't increase spaces in academies.
We have increased special needs places in our schools.
Yeah, and we have increased spaces in academies as well, in cooperation with them. My point is, because they have such a veto over it, really, they've got us.
But where there are LEA schools.
Yeah, there's not many LEA secondary schools left in this city.
At the moment, I thought we were also dealing with primary schools mostly, and feeding into secondary schools later. I mean, isn't primary schools the... 50% primary schools, But are we not looking at the places in primary schools, because we're anticipating those increasing obviously first before they get into secondary, so that our focus is on where we do own 50% of the schools, and beyond that will be secondary, where I suppose we have a different set of problems, but we still have the same issue, which is how do we go about from nowhere to somewhere?
I think to have an informed discussion, we need some assistance from our education colleagues.
We move on. Page 83, that's simply a question of mathematics. I don't understand how 1, 2, 3 and 4 add up. So, unless I've got it wrong, 16, 18-year-olds NEET are 4% 3-month average Q1, but percentage participating in education training at age 16 is 94.2. So there's going to be, by my reckoning, and 0.6% unknown. So 4.6% are outside, but only 94.2% are inside at 16, and at age 17, 88.7%. So how does that work?
Different age groups, if you look, 16 to 18, 16 to 18,
yes,
16
but,
17.
But absolutely, but if you had 88.7 and 94.2 don't get to the threshold of being... So if it said 98% in 16 and 88.7%, I could see that, but both of them are below the amount required to get to 100, if you added the two ones above it.
Yeah, there's no figures for 18. So the entire year group missing. So that's where your discrepancy comes.
So what we're saying is that 18, suddenly we've gone from 16 at 94.2, 17 at 88.7, and suddenly it's bounced back up to 97 or 98% at 18. I don't believe that for a minute. I mean, it's just, it doesn't make sense. I mean, unless we've got this policy of getting 18-year-olds into education or employment or training, and we don't do it for 16 or 17-year-olds.
We can ask an explanation. I suspect it will be to do with the levels of employment that kick in as you get to 17 and 18, and they therefore don't count as NEET, but don't count as being in training. So.
Page 85. This may just be wording, but I read KS1 reading, so the third, writing and maths combined, percentage at least expected standard. Is that the least one you're expecting, or the least that you expect? I mean, I don't know, with your at the least standard that's expected, or the standard that's the least expected. I'm assuming that we don't have such thing as a least expected standard. We have an expected standard at the very least. Am I right, or is that? Or do we actually say what we would put up with? Then in 18, we've got percentage of schools judged to be good or better if those schools have been inspected currently, 85.7%. But it doesn't say how many inspected and what percentage that represents. So, I mean, it could be 3 schools. I've been, so again, so this is the whole report of children's, and so I say at the very end, it's a very comprehensive, but there are no financials. 2, what keeps the director awake at night? I mean, obviously, in terms of worrying about how the department. And what strategies are there for improvement? Because I see none of those 3 things. It's a long read, I might say, but I did actually take most of it in, I think.
Is somebody coming from adults?
I think I should just say, because I've had an email from adults to say, unfortunately, they don't have anyone available to come along today. So I think my suggestion might be, if we are having a separate briefing for children's and adults, rather than me just sort of writing down and saying, I'll find out, whether perhaps it would be better to sort of save up the questions for that briefing.
In fact, it might be nice for them to know what kind of questions we're asking as well to the report, rather than, you know, it might focus what they have to do and make it less broad.
Chairman, a lot of these questions are very, very simple and straightforward, and perhaps we do need to look to see a way in which we could get those dealt with before the meeting, because I'm sure we could have furnished answers to all of these quite simply from somebody within the service today, rather than trying to deal with them within the meeting.
Is it sensible to put these questions in writing and send them all over to them in one mass so that they can just respond to them?
I think that yes, it is sensible, but at the same time, this is a meeting to which members of the public have come, are based on the information that they have seen and we have seen and we're being provided, and we are asking questions on our behalf and their behalf. And it seems to me that if these questions weren't asked before, when the reports were written and submitted and went through whatever process that they should have been through, then we are entitled at this moment to say, well, why didn't you ask those questions yourselves before you put them in front of the public and the councillors? And it might be an uncomfortable grilling, but it is I think that we are sensible people. I hope we are sensible people. We're looking at something that we're being delivered. And I get the feeling that it hasn't been properly considered at the highest level. It's just been, okay, well, let's send that off and see what happens. So I do feel we should be catechising it and asking those people who've been responsible sending this report to us and asking us to read it and to note it and to make our observations, that they then hear what our observations are, whether or not the answers are available to them at the moment. That is my considered opinion.
There's a balancing point, if I'm honest. Yes, we have a right to say, why were these questions not asked? But equally, if we spend the next hour asking 50 questions to which the answer is, we don't know on every single one, we're wasting an awful lot of everyone's time rather than writing them down and getting an answer back, which in a lot of these cases probably will be straightforward. So perhaps with that in mind, do we have some questions that we think we need to ask that we may get answers from today? And is there a mechanism for us to write out all the ones that we've all individually noted on these sheets and get them over ahead of a briefing so we can get a comprehensive list of answers back?
The things I have actually done quite a lot of work on are the children's and adult services, because not just because we're overspending, but actually they're comprehensive reports, which are good reports, but my aim is to make them better. Not just the services, but the reports better. So I don't really have very many more comments to make. We've done children's, and that's the most comprehensive. That's a very, it's great amount of information, and it's fulfilling, but you know, sort of there's a feeling that you didn't quite get the sugar on the shredders, as it were. So I'm just getting in adults. I've just got a few points to make. So the first one is page 89, which is a result of page 88 as well. There's no comparison with Q4 in 2017. It said as a snapshot. Well, a snapshot's a snapshot. It's a bit like telling us what money's in the account on the 30th of a month. It doesn't actually say whether we've got to spend an awful lot the next day or we've got less than we expected because of a particular outgoing. So there's no comparison with Q4 2017 or the whole of 2017 in terms of long-stay rest home care dementia. This is a big problem for our city, it seems to me, and it's going to get worse. And there's nothing which talks about national demographics. So what percentage of Portsmouth population is in the danger zone for dementia? Bear in mind, we've got 200,000 people in Portsmouth. I'm assuming that there's a percentage. What percentage nationally is there of dementia sufferers? And how does that compare with who we think require, late-stage dementia, require residential long-stay care, which I think is going to involve more and more patients, and both spelt TS and CE, as far as the council is concerned, and is going to absorb huge amounts of resources coming up. And just because it says that Portsmouth has residential nursing care beds available for those who are unable to live in their own home, it doesn't say for all those who are unable to live in their own home. It just says those who are unable to live. It does not give us, or certainly doesn't give me a sense that it is, that we have capacity. It gives a sense that what capacity we have is actually being fully used, which is obviously in its own right good. But if it means that we don't have capacity for people who need it, it's not good. So that is my question about it. It doesn't give us context. Then it talks about occupational therapy, I think. Well, no, page 90 it says Portsmouth has sufficient domiciliary care available to enable people with care and support needs to remain living independently in their own homes. Again, do we have sufficient domiciliary care available to enable all people with care and support needs to remain living independently in their own homes, or just some? That doesn't. It's a great statement, but it doesn't actually tell me whether or not we have comprehensively done it. That's page 90, the first bit. And it doesn't say what percentage of them are temporary, i.e. someone breaks their hip, needs 3 or 4 weeks domiciliary care, but after that it's fine, or those who are permanent. So that's another question, because obviously we are dealing with different requirements, and that doesn't tell us very much. And the next point is, to me, totally vital, which is Portsmouth Community Social Work and OT teams are able to assess and deliver services to ASC clients within a timely manner. I suppose that's our objective, isn't it? The waiting times, post-intervention average waiting times, were 22 days. And the waiting list as of May 2018 is 173 for social workers and 118 for occupational therapists. Does that mean that on average, 173 people are waiting 22 days in hospital to be discharged because we haven't got the facilities to give them occupational therapy or social workers? Because, it's a stark statement, but if we are dealing with the cost of the NHS, which of course is met by the NHS and not local authorities, so that's one of the reasons, of course, why it doesn't really work terribly well, it's not a great economy for everybody else, the taxpayer, if people are waiting 22 days in hospital when they don't need to be. And this is where I think, again, it's one of those hidden bits in a report, that if you don't know what it actually means in pounds, shillings and pence, and what it means in terms of the health service and the Queen Alexandra Hospital and various other things, you can skim over it. I'm sure I've skimmed over lots of things I haven't actually seen the true meaning to. But I do know this because I've had recent experience with my parents, that this is exactly what happens. You're stuck in hospital for an extra 3 weeks because we can't provide the occupational therapists or the social workers to deal with you at home. So that means it's bed blocking. It doesn't come out of our budget, so we're happy about it. It comes out of the National Health Service. But actually, we are doing a disservice to the taxpayer overall. And then your continuing healthcare and all the rest of it, 50% of referrals completed within 28 days. 50% of referrals completed within 28 days. That's a very long time.
Chairman, I think the important information there is contained in the second column, because there's been a significant amount of work which we've undertaken to try to reduce and actually improve the cooperation between ourselves and colleagues in the NHS to get people out of hospital quicker. And I think, again, the nature of these reports, they are written in shorthand, but I think comments and explanation from colleagues in Audit Social Care to explain what they're doing and the difficulties which they face to try and shorten this waiting list. There have been a number of interventions which have taken place where we have tried to reduce the waiting time, and we are swimming against the stream when we're working with the NHS in some of these areas.
And what does DST mean?
Okay, we'll have to make sure we don't any more of those acronyms.
Does anyone know
Don't
what DST
know.
means in this
Department for Transport, of course.
DST. Is it for
Yeah, we're shipping them up.
it's for dyslexics, isn't it?
I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but from my time on the hospital board, it's a tool.
Yeah, I think it's an assessment tool.
So, yeah.
But yeah.
I remember it being referred to, but equally I cannot remember what the acronym was.
Decisions. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Yes, so I accept that there's work here, but this is central to what we need to be looking at in adult social services. But the point is that if we keep someone in hospital, of course, it doesn't cost us. And the temptation, my question is it the temptation within our budgets not to spend money if we can get somebody else to spend the money?
Really it isn't. We are trying to work very closely with the NHS to try and shorten these amount of times. I think the whole process is particularly complex. I think it'd be really worthwhile having a briefing session from our colleagues in adult social care to explain what they're trying to do and the difficulties which they have. I wouldn't want it to be suggested that we're being any way obstructive or passing the buck whenever it comes to costs.
Fine. Thank you. And then page 94, it says at the bottom of column 3, which I can't remember what it means, but I'm sure it's something. It says delays due to procurement issues for information and advice. How long are the delays and what is the effect of them in terms of, is there a financial implication to that? It's a stark statement, delays due to procurement issues, but it isn't actually very helpful except to say that either the procurement system isn't working properly, we've gone for the wrong thing, or whatever, but it doesn't allow us to do anything except, well, there shouldn't be delays due to procurement issues if we need the thing. So it's an admission, but it's not helpful. And so I'm not actually asking the answer to the question there. On page 96, it says, support for ASC day centres and residential units. It says, time limited piece of work now complete, removed for next quarter, objectives achieved. What were the objectives? I mean, an IWT means in work team or in... But what were the objectives? And if they've been achieved, how great. But it's... If we've got a success story to tell, why not tell it? And I think I've nearly got to the end of my green things on all of this. There's lots of questions, but the green thing is sort of... this is in direct... yes, sorry, this goes to direct performance monitoring. And talking about drug-related deaths and various other things, again, it tells us that we're significantly higher than England and we're significantly worse than everybody else, but it doesn't say whether or not we are actually looking to find out why that might be. Because it seems to me, if people are dying on us or suffering more from self-harm and various other things, why are we, do we have somebody or some team going to find out why that's happening? There's no, we will have. Well, it would be helpful in the trend bit to say that actually we are looking at it and we're trying, we have a team that then we have a report will come back to whomever at a particular point, because at the moment it just tells us what the evidence is, but not what we're trying to do about it. So for the time being, I think I'm...
Thank you.
I'm going onwards for that. First of all, a comment, page 107. The key progress in Q1 is that they will recruit 60 staff. I hardly see that an aspiration is key progress. Very peculiar, that one. If we come on now to a governance issue, and a quite a substantial one, page 112, this is the whole question of air quality management areas and air quality management in this city. Now, quite clearly, this runs across a number of directors. In fact, it runs right the way through anything to do with health, housing, environment. We've got some aspiration there, but how is it going to be managed? What is the governance structure going to be? Who will it reported to? Where does the finance trail lie? And I would like the answer to that at some stage, please.
And I understand a report is being prepared by Pam Turton at the moment, which is intended to come to Cabinet shortly.
Oh, it's transport as well.
Yeah, it is transport as well. I mean, I have been discussing with the Chief Executive actually where we believe within the local authority responsibility for air quality management should lie, both because our air quality management at the moment, when we look at it, it's a very historical look at air quality management, something which rested with environmental health, which isn't really the modern concern. We're concerned at the moment about across a number of departments and services, but we're particularly concerned about the nitrogen dioxide levels which are being generated in the city by traffic. So yes, there is a traffic concern. This is written within the Director of Public Health's remit at the moment, but certainly there is a report coming forward. It may be written by Transport, but I think it probably won't be going to T&T for a decision. That's something which we need to resolve. But the answer to your question is there is a significant piece of work in hand on this at the moment, and I hope it will deal with those concerns.
Well, certainly it is sufficiently wide across the authority that I would hope that we would have a report back here on its governance and its management.
Thank you.
Well, that's... again, there's a question which of page 125, we've got a deteriorating situation quite clearly in legally required homeless decisions, number of households and homelessness. Now this is being audited, but I think it is another one where there's obviously cost implications for us, and it would be useful to have some indication of what those cost implications are. And so that's that one. And we have a question of benefits. Page 176 and all other areas of benefit. We are moving into a much more complex, from the point of view of the individual citizen of this city, a much more complex area with not merely the benefits which we administer, but also the introduction of universal credit, and universal credit will impinge upon the way in which we deliver our services. I think it would be useful that we, as the audit committee and the audit function, have a report on that one. Those are the main issues which have not been covered, which I would bring up.
Are we into document 2? Am I...
Yes, okay, let's go to document 2.
If we go to document 2, HR Legal and Performance, page 188. 8.5 days average per employee per year. But you don't do it in quartiles. I know this is... I'm not asking for this in every respect, but I would imagine there are some long-term sick involved in this who make a difference. For example, we all know that although we think the average number of legs people have in the UK is 2, it's 1.9 something or other, because there are some people who don't have any or just 1. So it would be useful to have a quartile of long-term sick, and so that rather than just the total average, then maybe the top and the bottom quartiles.
Yeah, I can certainly provide that. What I would say, though, is quite a lot of information on this gets reported already into Employment Committee. You obviously have overview of sickness.
No, I understand
as
that, but
part of
it
their
also impacts later on in the report that Lizzie's produced about the 45 days that she has spare when she has 14 employees, and if they took 8.5 days off on average, then we'd be stuffed.
It's much lower in internal audit. That's an average across the organisation. It's round about 2 to 3 days.
Obviously, it's a much nicer place to work than anywhere else. But so there's that. There's moving on through. These green things are very useful. Oh yes, IT. I actually only have one really question about it, and you may, as I think, I don't know, maybe up to incidents, i.e. tickets. We have 533. I'm not quite sure if that's the whole quarter, in which case it's out. It's extraordinary, but if it is the whole quarter, that'd be amazing. 533 tickets. How many first, second, and third liners do we have in our IT department? Could I have the answer to that, please? Because it's a very small amount of tickets for the number of people I think are employed to deal with them. And then the port. So no, I've gone out. IT gone. But you might not be able to help me with this, or perhaps I should know, but I don't. Page number 202. Berth 3 link span purchase. Primary period of the lease end. I have no idea what Berth 3 link span is, and I just wondered whether, since legal advice has been provided and you're the city solicitor, you might be able to explain what.
Rather sadly, I can tell you what a link span is. it's the piece of bridging work that allows vehicles to drive from the land onto the vessels.
So just then, how much was it? It doesn't tell us.
Yeah, huge amount, and we got an EU subsidy for part of it, I seem to remember as well.
To buy a brand new one is circa 9 to 12 million.
Can't you get them on eBay?
This is a negotiation that's going on to buy a existing link span and that's come to the end of its lease. And I'm trying to remember what the figure is. It's circa. I can come back to you what the number is, but it is a large sum. But it's. I keep trying. The figure I've got in my head is 2, but I need to come back to you and tell you what it is.
But the question is are we going to buy it and lease it to the port? Is the port going to buy it? And if so, is it on our balance sheet, their balance sheet? Is
the port and PCC are the same organisation.
Of course, it's not. Yes, it's not a limited company. No, thank goodness for that.
Yes. Is there a real danger that the lessor might serve termination and we would have problems in actually running the port?
They would have great difficulties in removing it.
Yes, it raises some very interesting thoughts of how they would actually stop us using it. But
we're in very active discussions with the owners of it.
Saying it's actually in place at the moment, but we don't own it.
Yes.
Oh, I see. So it's all right. I thought we were going to sort of transport it from Bristol or something.
We've been leasing it for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's now at the end of that lease, and we're looking to buy the asset rather than to continue leasing.
So it's a bit like scaffolding, where we pay a scaffolder enough to buy the scaffolding for him to put it up, basically, and then once he's done one, he's got the whole. He owns it forever. It's that kind of process, is it? Okay. So if we move on to page 206, this is actually where I was referring again earlier on to parent and infant relationship service. It's point 3. It says implement expert trauma-informed approaches to supporting children and young people in our care designed to repair harm they've experienced. you're right that it's a policy decision, Chairman, but actually because it's been put in three areas of this report, of this full report that we've waded through on our own volition, I still think it's important that when we do get the children's services to come and talk to us, that we are allowed to focus on this very important point, because it often falls between two stools in children's services and adult services. Yeah, the other one is page 210. I'd love to know what transition between Swift, AIS and System 1 means, because it looks incredibly impressive, but I've absolutely no idea what it means.
Well, Swift is their existing software system, and System 1 is the system that they're moving to.
And what's AIS?
You got me there.
If we've got you, then you've definitely got me.
It's a system, I believe it's used by adult social care. System 1, you'll be pleased to hear, is the system which is used in commonality with NHS and with all of the majority of the GPs within the city. So that's going to help us tremendously to be able to share information appropriately and to work more closely with the GPs and with the hospital across the city. It wasn't, I would hasten to add, necessarily our first choice, but we're moving to System 1 so we can work better with our other neighbours in health.
Further information can be seen in the minutes of yesterday's meeting of Portsmouth.
4.5 hours. Then page 211, which we're now going to, the achieving financial balance and all the rest of it. I was impressed with what Julian said about not giving children's services so much money they go out and spend it, because of course that's exactly what you do if you increase the budget. But I would therefore suggest we think hard about increasing the contingency of the council to make sure that we do have within a budget that's balanced rather than drawing out of reserves unless we absolutely have to. We have enough to anticipate what we can't, the children's services and adult services we're already anticipating. So it doesn't belong to them as a budget, but it doesn't actually at the same time give us a shock to the system.
Yes, I'm very pleased you support our use of contingency, having had the discussions with you about contingency in the past. What we do is every year we do set the level of contingency at a level to ensure that we can set a robust and resilient budget. What I would say is, because our budget is currently in balance in that the money we expect to spend is equal to the income we expect to get, if we're looking to increase contingency, we'll be looking for commensurate savings elsewhere within the council in order to free up the headroom within the budget to increase contingency. But whether we're creating or finding services elsewhere within the budget to create headroom for contingency, or to increase the children's base budget, it still means we've got to find savings elsewhere within the council. We can't just increase the budget.
I do understand that, but there isn't a magic monetary unless you have to MMD, because last year I think that we didn't expect to put any money into MMD. We put 4.3 million in on some, or that's what it seemed to suggest. But that must have come from somewhere, and that must also have meant that to balance our budget, and I'm sure it was a revenue expense, I don't think it was a capital expense. So we find these things somewhere when we think it's worth having them. And so somebody must have juggled the figures and given us a reworked budget. Sometime slipped it under the radar when I wasn't looking, sometime late last year or something. But we did put £4.3 million out of revenue into MMD, and that must have been part of a contingency or something, because it certainly won't have, it didn't bust the budget, but it was a lot of money. So yes, I accept that we do need to have a sufficient contingency, but we're also spending it on pet projects, perhaps, that we might think very hard about whether we should carry on doing it at that level in future, if it means that we can't properly fund adults and children's services, which is what we're here to do.
You're quite right. The figure we paid to MMD is the figure. I'm not sure whether it was 4.1 or 4.3. It was included within the budget. What I would say is that was a one-off item of expenditure, and there are a number of moving wheels within the budget, which some things will create a one-off in-year headroom and other things won't. it's easier to find a one-off increase in the budget, such as this 4.3 million was, as opposed to finding on an ongoing annual basis, which is what we would be having to do with children's.
Thank you, Julie. But my question is, does that mean we're never going to have any more money into MMD?
As I haven't got a crystal ball, I would like to say no, but I can't see it myself. But but when you see the report that's coming back to governance and audit, I think next time round, which is going to be talking to you about the financial relationships between Portsmouth and MMD, I think that will, well, there's no think about it, that will show you there is a net benefit to PCC as a result of operating MMD.
Lies, damn lies and statistics, aren't there, really?
Yeah, let's save MMD for next time.
Page 215. We have Oak Dean, accommodation provisional for people with mental health needs. It is marked red throughout. I've got a couple of questions here. The first one is, how does the responsibility for this balance between NHS and Portsmouth City Council? And since this would appear to be something which is fairly urgent, we have negotiating relevant funding and delay to project. Does this mean we're negotiating to delay the project further, or that we are concerned and holding negotiations to try and minimise the delay? This is one of those where it would be very useful from an auditing position to know exactly what is going on, and if nobody here knows, could a note be sent round to all members of this committee?
A note can be sent round. All I can say to help from the legal point of view is that I understand that there were problems with the purchase of the property and providing sufficient funding. Those problems have now been resolved, therefore we're in the process of completing the purchase of the property from Solent, I'll get further information sent to you to deal
Does
with all
this
of those
then
concerns.
relate to a change in the responsibility for such young people being transferred from Solent to Portsmouth City Council? Or how is this going to work? Are we going to be landlords and Solent provide the services, or how is it going to work?
I'll get the details for you.
Oak Dean doesn't currently used for that service. It's a surplus building. It's in St James's.
Yes, I know where it is.
Yeah,
I've been
but
in there a number of times.
Yeah, it doesn't
for
provide
various
that
reasons.
service at the moment. They're selling the building to us, and we want to put a different service into it, I think.
What's the patient was?
Well, as a
Which is to do with, where is it? I can't find it now. It's, am I going backwards or forwards? 2, 3, 4, I'm going forwards. It's the one where we're actually spending money on it. Demolition and stuff. Where do you think it is? 2, 3, yes, it is. It says December 2019, grounds of investigation and site work is complete. Oh, is that when the project's supposed to finish? To December 2019. Anyway, grounds of investigation site work is complete. Full funding has been approved. Is that in addition to the 4.1 million or 3 million that we spent last year?
You're talking. This is the capital budget now. So.
In addition to the 4.3 million.
Oh yeah, yes it is.
Oh, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to hear that. All my companies have such great benefactors.
I'm now on to Appendix 4. Oh, right, you've got some Appendix 3.
Yeah, the general data protection regulations, of which I suspect our esteemed city solicitor is perfectly well aware, because it mentions him by name in 3 points at least. A tutorial for those who will be given access to the Information Asset Register has been written and approved. Issues with the Electronic Information Asset Register have been fixed, and the Programme Manager is in the process of arranging for individuals to have access. Does that mean it's a 241? All right, so I do apologise. does that mean that it's a secure access facility? So it's an interrogation that you're doing to protect the data you have and to make sure that only people who are authorised to do so may interrogate data, and presumably for only particular reasons. Yes. So you're about the only person who lived everything, and then a couple of people below you can look at half the things each, and then below that can look at a quarter and whatever it is. Is this how it?
Absolutely right. I mean, we've been working on this for some time, and it's terribly important as part of our work towards GDPR, actually getting in place a proper asset register and ensuring that only these people who need to access it can, and that will be put in place.
Thank you. And I don't know whether it's in that or in the final analysis, but there's certainly something I remember seeing that we've set a strategy in place to try to demonstrate to the Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, that we've tried to do things even if we haven't succeeded in doing them. And is that what you're trying to tell me? Now, I don't know whether that's a later point in terms of the final risk register.
The difficulty which we have in being fully compliant with GDPR, which is probably not unlike many other people, whilst we do have a very high level of knowledge, the training has been undertaken for all of the staff to ensure that they know their roles and responsibilities. A number of the systems which we have are not GDPR compliant, and the systems providers are either A, asking for astronomical sums to make them compliant, or B, saying they won't make them compliant, in which case we're having to change to alternative systems. Some of them have now changed their position when we've said, okay, that's fine, if you're not going to make your system compliant, then we'll have to look at another provider. So we have a number of systems which we need to work our way through to make them compliant, but we can't do that until the providers actually rewrite the software or provide the updates to make them compliant. That's where we are deficient. It's not unlike many other people, but we're doing the best that we can with the systems which we use at the moment. We have a large number of systems, as you know, in the Council.
Obviously, the big one is Oracle, which apparently means to be able to foretell the future and can't even deal with the past. Can you update us on what is happening with Oracle? I know they've asked for an astronomical sum, but it is the biggest amount of data we have, and it is the most uncompliant we do have in the whole of the Council.
Well, Jules is very well placed to assist, and I'll chirp in.
They have provided us with some tools that can obfuscate HR-related data, and we're testing those programs at the moment. We're testing those programs at the moment before we'll run them on the production database. When it comes to accounts payable and accounts receivable, it's slightly harder to obfuscate the data because there are so many differing fields in which you can store information that can identify the individual, which may not necessarily have been designed for that purpose. What we are currently doing is we are also, to take up Michael's point about looking at changing systems where they're not compliant, we are currently doing a review of our current system with a view to looking to change it to a cloud-based system in the future.
So this is Oracle, is it? Yes. I remember mentioning in 2016, I thought you would be doing that then. And everyone said, oh no, it'd be far too expensive, far too difficult, and all the rest of it. Just for my own purposes of clarification, is the word obfuscate the new council word for not being able to delete, but at least being able to do something about it? Because delete is actually what we should be doing. That's what the GDPR is asking us to do, to delete all material that is not required by the council to own on every single person that we have. And obfuscation sounds as though what you're trying to do is to hide it somewhere, but it's still there, and if somebody actually managed to get to it, it would not be deleted, it would be available to get.
Now, obfuscation, basically, Oracle, like many other systems, are relational databases. You cannot just delete information from a relational database because it leaves orphan records hanging in the system. What obfuscation does is it, for example, would identify a field that's got a person's name in it, and it would just replace that with a series of X's. So it would actually overwrite the information that's there, replacing it with a series of X's or something like that. But the links in the links in purchase order records or HR records that are still linked to that field will return X's rather than the person's name. Obfuscation, as I understand it, is a term that is used by the Data Commissioner and is an acceptable treatment for fields that aren't physically deleted.
Us is that Oracle has turned from a slightly sexy program to XXX, is that right?
Hugh, you on to the next appendix, I think?
Just one matter on Appendix 4, which is the risk register, which has so much which is marked in red and high. I assume it will be red. That with children's services, with adult services, and there is quite a good commentary on the mitigation. But it would appear that we have a very serious management issue here, that we are coming beyond our ability to manage within the resources which we have available because of these very high risks which have been noted. It's risks in obtaining staff, obtaining teachers, people being overworked, action plans are being drawn up. I think that we do need, when we come to have a look at these on the 19th of October, we do need a full report on the mitigation strategy and how far that mitigation strategy will work, and whether there is a point at which we can no longer mitigate and we will our services will seriously deteriorate. And we need that kind of report on the 19th of October, if you please. That's all I have to say on the risk
If I just follow up, what we've been told is that Children's Services is £5 million overspent, or budgeted to be £5 million overspent for the year, and yet we still, in addition to that, have high-risk areas. I'm assuming that the 5 point whatever it is million that we're overspending will not address any of these high-risk factors. What we're saying is that despite the additional cost of children in care and cared for children and foster care and goodness knows what care, all these issues are in addition to the basic statutory funding that we need to put into children's services, the 5 point whatever it is that we are expecting to overrun this year. Or are we saying, or is Alison, I have to say I'm extremely impressed with her, and I'm extremely impressed with the way she's presented her reports, whether she's written them or commissioned them from one of her staff, and I think she's a very good thing. But if she's telling us that despite the extra 5 million that we've budgeted, or reluctantly coming out of reserves or whatever it is that's coming out of, to pay for children's services for this year, these issues are still pertaining and worrying and risks to the council's ability to provide high quality services, that worries me even more than the £5.4 million or whatever it is that we're overspending in that department.
It must be the case where we've been told that strategies are being developed, that the full funding implications haven't yet been established.
I think that these are problems that arise despite the additional funding, rather than to be dealt with by the additional funding. Partly, probably there will be, but
yeah, partly.
But this is not. Yeah.
We don't know the answer yet, but there is that possibility.
Yeah, I noted particularly, so obviously the two are linked, but that even the first point, demand pressures, makes the point that notwithstanding additional investment, this is still a risk. So it's clear that there's additional risk.
Yes, I'm interested that we are a subject discussion in page 274. It's always nice to be told that, as your committee, that we're actually we're at risk. Are we at risk existentially or just? What was interesting was that in the last meeting, I specifically addressed this point. I specifically addressed the point that I thought it was important that we made sure that we didn't risk our internal audit integrity on the grounds that we didn't have enough staff or we were doing far too much outside. And I was told at the time, and I think it's probably in the minutes somewhere, that there was no such risk. And yet there I find it in Q1 risk register. It's actually there. Exactly what I suggested was a potential risk. And it's a medium risk. It's not even negligible or low. It's a medium risk. And that worries me because it means that what I was told at the last meeting is different from what someone thinks is the risk to the organisation. And unless I'm wrong, did I not ask that question, and was I not reassured?
You did ask, and you were reassured by me. I think, I mean, it's correct to be aware of it as a risk. It is a risk. It's a case of whether it's a risk that's being properly managed and mitigated. And I think it will be wrong for me as a service director to not include it on my register of known risks, because that's the whole point of having a risk register. But that doesn't mean to say that we're about to collapse in a heap as a result of it, because as detailed in the mitigating actions, that's a risk that's being managed and mitigated.
Yeah, I think the question last time was whether we were just playing catch up again, which is we get commissions from outside, and then we have to create more positions for staff, and there will always inevitably be a lead time between us having to provide those services outside and training people up in the team to be able to cope with it. So my question is, from my private life, I mean my private side of work, is we have a large finance team, and it strikes me that there must be a possibility that we could be looking to poach people from there, as possibly, if we needed to, as recruits and who know the system, because it might be easier to fill the posts within a larger finance team than it is to fill an audit team. So I'm wondering whether you actually have a strategy to identify people who might be candidates for internal audit, given that the capacity increased, or the capacity, the demand increased, the capacity was not there yet to cope with it. But I would see that as a logical step. I don't know whether you do.
Yeah, I mean, generally over time we have strengthened the team both in terms of size and skills in order to be able to deal with what is an ever-increasing range of external clients, and that's been a journey that the audit team's been on for a number of years. We certainly have recruited people from finance, haven't we, yeah, both from within the council and from outside of it, because clearly there are transferable skills there, and people learning finance qualifications do obviously get some exposure to audit as part of that, and some of it enjoy that so much that they are keen to come back to audit, at which point they're qualified.
Obviously, light side, because you've got such low sickness. So it must be a delight to work in the internal audit team, and a very relaxed atmosphere, clearly, because otherwise people go home with stress or something. So then we go through to Chris Ward's team. There's a bit about IT. Single points, so page 279, single points of failure in ICT infrastructure and systems access. Again, it's a very wishy-washy thing. A single point of failure could be the whole thing goes down, of the main server that's operating all the servers, and that was single point of failure, and that would certainly scupper us for a while. I don't see anything that I mean, there's the strength of cybersecurity arrangements. Are we focused on that? Because there is a phrase that's going around in IT, which is 37% of companies have actually been targeted, attacked, and suffered from it. And the difference between them and the 63% who haven't is that they haven't yet. Everyone will be, and it's incredibly important, and it gets more and more important the more sophisticated our international friends and enemies involved. It still makes me wonder why we don't actually have somebody who understands IT who is actually an IT person running the IT department. I still don't understand it, but I keep getting overruled on that. I think that we need to have somebody, especially as things get more complicated, sophisticated, and the remedy, we've got cloud and all the rest of it, we should have somebody in charge of IT, dedicated to IT, and not also trying to look at whether the council's financially solvent.
Chairman, really not appropriate discussion for this place because it relates to an individual. Can we have discussion elsewhere?
Fine, yep. Page 281 is to do with maritime incidents such as fire collision. Do we have insurance on this? I don't know whether this looks like the only time. I mean, nobody in HR, for example, says that we're worried about the building burning down, which it might, obviously. But it talks about maritime incidents such as fire collision on grounding or blocking the harbour, or terrorist alert on a vessel. Do we have insurance?
Yes,
So
all those matters are insured.
So it's not really a risk.
Well, you wouldn't have insurance if it wasn't a risk.
What I mean is it's not a risk to the council because the council is insured. No, but is it? So what I'm saying is I'm assuming that every risk that we're looking at is not an insured risk. And
Even if we've got insurance, there's the disruption to the service which will result. And there is also the excess on any insurance claim, because any first £50,000 of any claim is our liability. We wouldn't want to be claiming against the policy as well, because of course that will put up future premiums. So you will get items in here which are fully insured, but we consider them, for all of the above reasons, still to be a risk.
thank you. Yeah.
Any further questions on that one? Okay. Moving on to report on Hampshire Community Bank. Just before we move on, I should highlight I have an appointment that I have to leave for 1:15, so I will hand over to Hugh if we're not done at that point. Hampshire Community Bank.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The report sets out details of the original decision in 2014 to invest £5 million in the creation of Community Bank, of which to date 2.5 million of that investment has been made. The report outlines the company structures, provides an overview of progress to date, and identifies the regulatory process and timetable, along with setting out some of the key milestones. The next one being the challenge session expected in Q4 2018, followed by the authority being able to trade as a bank, but with restrictions during Q2 of 2019, and with those restrictions being lifted by 2020. Although the latest report from BDO, who are the bankers' advisors, have said that there may be a need for a further contingency to be built into that. Members are asked to note the contents of the report.
Thank you. I suspect we have plenty of questions on this.
I have two, really. One is was raised by Ms Brown, which tells us that we own a very large proportion of the bank compared to anybody else, apart from the trustees. And I understand the structure is that the trust owns 50%, and the other shareholders are the people set out on page 287 are the other shareholders of it. I think that's what it transpires, and I imagine that Dr. Werner is paid by two of them, but can't be paid as a trustee. And on 6.8, so it has lent 950,000. Is that right?
Local First Community Interest Company has advanced some loans, which was from a Green Deal grant that was made by central government and administered by Eastleigh. So the bank itself hasn't made any loans. It's been done through this other organisation.
So we haven't. We simply acquired the loan. Have we acquired it at pound for pound, or will we know that? And the question is, am I right in thinking that we've already lost 5% by losing the 46,000 that one debtor who unfortunately went into administration? So or 4%, so 1.145 million had been given to 13 different companies, and 46,000. Not a great deal in the grand scheme of things, but it means that we've got a negative return, or they have, or is that? But is that Hampshire Community Bank who suffered the loss, or is it first community interest company, local first community interest company, beforehand, are we?
Who owns the loan?
Well, we probably. Well, I don't know. I mean, we don't own the loss, but did we incur the loss? Did Hampshire Community Bank incur the loss, or did the Eastleigh?
Local First Community Interest Company bore that loss of 46,000.
And who owns them?
They're an organisation in their own right.
Well, sorry, I thought this was going to be quite simple and easier, but it isn't. So what? Why is it even mentioned? What's it got to do with the Hampshire Community? I read it that somehow the Hampshire Community Bank had suffered a loss, but actually you're saying that it hasn't. So why is it mentioned in that? Because it's quite confusing. It makes it look as though we haven't done terribly well in the first instance. But if it's got nothing to do with it,
those loans are Hampshire Community Bank didn't advance the original loans. Local First Community Interest Company has. Hampshire Community Bank can take on the loan book for non-individuals. It can take on the loan book for commercial organisations, and that's what it's done. The loss of the loan occurred, and the Community Interest Company has borne that loss, not Hampshire Community Bank.
So what you're just saying is that we've transferred 1,099,000 into Hampshire Community Bank Limited because the 46,000 comes off the 1,145,000 to make 1,099,000.
Yes.
Well, why didn't we say so? It's easier.
I have a number of questions. What I suggest is I go through the questions and then, where it is possible to answer them today, they'll be answered, if not, at a later stage. I think, in terms of both auditing this and the governance of it, we made 62.5% of the provision for this bank to date. So I think we have a right to ask questions of it. Why has it taken so long to get the banking license? The nearest comparator I can find is Redwood Bank, which specialises in SMEs, is largely funded by Warrington Borough Council, who put in a very large amount of money, but that merely took them 2 years from inception to full licence. We are coming up against the backstop date of December 2018, and it looks as if we will not have for at least another 15 months to 18 months after that a full banking licence, if what I am told is correct. So why is it taking so long compared to other banks? Then in terms of governance, we have put in 62.5% of the provision. How much influence over the policy and operations of the bank does that give us? Because it would appear that the people who have put up the cash, the local authorities, the universities and the like, do not have over 50% of the voting rights. 50% of the voting rights remain with the charitable organisation, which has it put in any money at all, we're not sure. And also some of the voting rights lie with this community interest group, of which we have heard. So we are the major contributor. How much influence do we have over policy and operations, and how is that written into the organisation? In 2014, we were told that councillors would be informed on an ongoing basis. That was part of the report in 2014, which I have here. How have councillors been informed as this has been developed? I think we do need a report on that. Also, we were told that it would recruit and train its staff from the local community, 6.2. I have seen the advertisement which was put in the German press for chief officers. My German has now slightly better than it was when I first saw that, and I would like to know why we are not taking the staff from the local community. Also, the other governance one is there a succession plan if Professor Werner falls under Mr. Brown's bus?
Will he be driving?
He might have been driving it, yes. I am glad that the matter of this peculiar loan, which in some ways would appear that we were claiming credit for, is not our loan, and it is not administered through us, and we are not bearing the loss. Having some responsibility or some link into this loan. How much of the lending which came through this community interest company has been to people in the Portsmouth area? After all, if we are putting up well over half of the money into this bank, we need to know what the benefits are for the people of Portsmouth and especially for the SMEs in Portsmouth. It is also stated on the operation that our investment is safe since it is backed by property. What property is backing this? And the fact that you have bad debts on this 1 million loan, which we may or may not be related to us, seems to suggest otherwise, that this is not necessarily as safe as would be presented. Then I find the various, what I would like, and I'm sure this should not be asked today, is how the thing actually works. It seems to be working somewhat differently from what was set out in 2014. So if they're making loans, particularly to SMEs, now is this to SMEs which could not get bank loans, implying that there's a higher risk than to a normal bank in our lending, or because we are charging a lower interest rate than would be charged by a commercial bank, noting that the average, I am told, for SMEs at the current time is 7%. Now, if investors are promised a 6% return, paragraph 326, and depositors 1% above an interbank offer rate, which currently is, I think, 6.4, it's very difficult to see how the HCB can safely make loans. Its margins would appear to be very, very, very tight. And doing a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, if 50% of the surplus net, presumably net surplus, is going to charity, the surplus needs to be 13 million over 5 years. Add this to a running costs of 5 million plus bad debt provision. It requires an average loan book over a 5-year period of round about 60 million at minimum, and one wonders whether this is feasible. How is it feasible? Is there that amount of demand? So I would like to see a spreadsheet showing us, as the major shareholders, how the thing is going to work. Then there are a couple of other minor matters I would like to raise. PCC recently this year has allowed for up to 10 million to be made available to purchase bonds. Now that presumably would make us an investor who would be promised 6% on those bonds. When are we likely to have to buy them? Is there any, would this be immediately on getting the banking license? Would it be before getting the full banking license, if they only got a partial banking license? Or would it be at some time thereafter? When would we be expected to expend that money? And there was a very peculiar sum in paragraph 3.2.4, which I will come to. Yes, provide funding to support 375 million of investment in the Hampshire economy. Does this mean that the bank in the long run intends to put in 375 million, to a loan 375 million, or does it mean that it will be part of 375 million of investment? Because it says provide funding to support. Exactly what does that mean? I would like that to be made clear. A few minor points which I hope we can get some answers to.
Thank you. I'll start answering some of the, well, perhaps we'll start by, perhaps I could ask you to, if you could let me have some of those questions in writing, because some of them I haven't been able to write them, I couldn't write them all down. Some of them I wouldn't be able to answer here today, but some of the ones that I was making a note of as we're going along, I can try and answer some of those for you. The reasons for the delay are laid out in section 7. As to why those delays have been encountered by Hampshire Community Bank but not encountered by the example that you gave, I'll need to get back to you on that. You're correct in saying that the voting rights are 50% of the voting rights have gone to those who made a equity investment, and that voting rights is on a investor by investor basis. It's not weighted in accordance with the number of equity shares that you purchased. With regard to what extent councillors have been informed, that's one of the things I would need to get back to you about. The loans to PCC and specifically the PCC area specifically. To date, there haven't been any loans into the PCC area. The funding that was available, that was made available, it was made specifically available to Eastleigh Council as a accountable body, and the loans were made in the Eastleigh and Winchester areas. With regard to the way you mentioned about the £10 million that the council would lend and the security of those, what assets those are secured on. Well, there's no loans actually been advanced yet that would require that security on assets to be in place. When the community banks start...
This was about bonds, I think,
yeah,
not about loans.
What the bonds is, what will happen is the local authority will issue, the community bank will issue a bond, and the local authority, bond or a loan, largely it's the same thing. Under our treasury management strategy, we would loan them up to £10 million. They can then make those as loans to small and medium-term enterprises without a banking licence, but those loans would be made secured against their assets. When the banking licence is issued, the bank would then be allowed to lend to individuals, and on that basis as well, loans would be made based where on a mortgage basis. So again, those loans would be backed by property. So that's how the security of the investment is covered off. And the final one that I made the note of is yes, I think you're probably asking to see the business case. So what we'll need to do as part of the feeding back to you is to go through the business case again to explain how the rationale for the investment was arrived at.
And what are the bank's, you talked about the bank's assets. We could loan them and they could loan them out without a full banking license, but this would be guaranteed against their assets. So does the bank have any assets at the moment?
How it would work is a small and medium enterprise would approach Hampshire Community Bank and ask for a loan to expand their business. The bank would advance them a loan on the basis that it was secured against assets within that business. If Hampshire Community Bank failed, if the SME failed to repay Hampshire Community Bank, then Hampshire Community Bank could recover the money through the security of the asset. If Hampshire Community Bank failed to repay the loan back to PCC, then we would be able to take over the assets. Sorry, we would take responsibility of the loan to the small and medium term enterprise, and so the security of the asset would pass to us.
But if one of those enterprises to which loans were made went into liquidation, bankruptcy, it might not have assets available, or we could only get a small proportion from the assets, as is normal in bankruptcy, surely.
Yeah, that would be quite true. If there was a shortfall on liquidation to pay the creditors, then there would be there could well be a loss. But as a lender, the council would, or the authority would be, or the Hampshire Community Bank would be have a charge on the asset, so they would be one of the first people to receive their money back. But yes, there would be a risk that if the value of the assets didn't meet the cost of the loan, there would be a loss. But the community bank would only lend where there was, in their view, sufficient cover of the loan from the asset base of the company.
Sorry, at this point I'm going to have to pass over to Hugh to chair. Apologies, I can't avoid this appointment, unfortunately.
If I could just, I didn't have very many questions, but I've suddenly raised some. But it's just, what is the difference between Hampshire Community Bank and TSB, for example, the commercial side? Because basically, as far as I can understand it, you're dealing with a simple banking arrangement, and there's no difference other than the bank takes the risk and gets its money for taking the risk, or we take the risk. I mean, I do understand debentures and charges on property, but if you're saying to a company where you actually want a small medium enterprise or medium enterprise to succeed, that they have to put up asset, then I mean, obviously you'd want to put a charge against them if they're buying plant or all the rest of it. But if you're putting a charge against the company, then actually you're effectively not producing an entrepreneurial community bank in the way that a sort of extended version of the micro banks that happen in Bangladesh and various places, where you're actually trying to get seed capital into companies where they might not have access to capital elsewhere. But if you're doing it on the same terms as you are on a commercial banking proposition, then why are we doing it? We might just as well just take the money back and tell them to go to NatWest or Lloyds. So I mean, it seems to me, although I wasn't there at the very start of this process, that the principle of having a community bank together was so that we could actually invest in the community, not risking too much capital in the process, but actually benefiting our own area. We've put £2.5 million in cash into it. It hasn't lent any money, but somehow it's giving us a return of, say, 1%. I don't know what it's giving us a return of on that money that's there. Well, no, we haven't, because it's equity. So, in fact, we haven't actually. We have no money coming back from this bank. So we put £2.5 million. It's bought a loan book, apparently, which has suffered already a £46,000 loss on it. So a 4% decrease from its 1.145 million. We don't know what's in that loan, but we do know, apparently, that it doesn't have asset-backed lending, which is in fact exactly what I'd anticipated the Hampshire Community Bank to be, a non-asset-backed lender, presumably depending on all sorts of circumstances, and that some would succeed and some wouldn't, and it's part of a means of getting money into our system by having business rates, for example, because a company that operates in Portsmouth is going to pay business rates, etc., etc. So we would actually get benefit. It would employ people. It would do things that actually meant that we were benefiting our community. Well, we haven't. Hampshire Community Bank hasn't done anything, and what it has done is not in Portsmouth. We've put the most amount of money in it, and now what you're telling us is that it operates like a board of directors, where irrespective of how many shares you have in it, you only have one voice, except presumably at an AGM. And I can't understand why that would be at all attractive to anyone with any sense at all, if you weren't actually doing a benefit to the community and citizens of Portsmouth, because you're not. You're actually running a bank that is trying to compete with banks that have got dog-eat-dog principles about them, we will be no better and probably considerably worse than a bank that's been around for a very long time and knows what it's doing, even if we have the professor from Southampton who knows absolutely everything about banking because he worked for Bear Stearns, which went bust in 2007, I might remind people if they actually wanted to know about it. So I don't think that the original prospect of this Hampshire Community Bank, which was to help the community, was to be a benefit to us, has turned into anything other than a shadow of a commercial operation like Metro Bank, which itself has only taken 7 years to turn a profit. It's only just made £10 million and invested considerably more than that. So it's £10 million operating profit after 7 years. I don't see that this is a viable proposition for us to carry on doing. I mean, if I would look at Vessel's much better than this. This is effectively us pretending to be bankers as opposed to helping the community to access cash without having to put up assets, without having their livelihoods destroyed if something goes wrong. And we know that business works like that. So I do not understand how this has gone from being what I think Hugh described when he proposed it a long time ago, although I wasn't there at the time but might well have voted for it had I been, something that's for the benefit of us, to something that is actually a shadow of what it was intended to be, I think. I don't know whether that concords with what you've come up with.
Certainly it isn't what I think either Councillor Luke Stubbs or I imagined that we were proposing and seconding 4 years ago.
Can I just pick up on one point? I think you conflated two things. What I said was, in order for City Council to lend £10 million worth, £10 million loan to Hampshire Community Bank, we would be required for it to be secured on assets. That doesn't mean to say all the bank's lending will be secured on assets. It's for us to lend them £10 million, we will require security. Otherwise, we will not lend them £10 million.
Yes, but that's the point, isn't it? That's why you get such things as junk bonds and things in the world. A bond is a bond, you're lending them, and yes, you have a charge on their assets, but if they have no assets at the end of it because they've made some very unfortunate lending propositions and tried to be a bank and failed to be a bank, there won't be any asset left because it will all have gone. Because they're giving money away, there won't be anything, there won't be, it's notorious what happens in banking. If confidence goes, if the money isn't paid back, then people say, well, we don't have to pay it back. And you don't get the money, but that's how banks go bust. So it doesn't matter whether we've got, if we take a charge on Hampshire Community Bank's assets, its assets are its loan book, and as the government understood when it took over the loan book of RBS and NatWest Bank, it had nothing there. And it was only because it could sit out for 10 years that it actually got the money back. We are not the government, and we cannot turn around and say that we can say £10 million has gone to the Hampshire Community Bank based on its, on some kind of a debenture or whatever, but it's not security in the way that I would consider security. We're not buying a building. We're not, we are simply buying into a concept. So yes, we would have the backing, and maybe it can only lend commercial loans to SMEs secured on property of that SME's property. But if it's doing that, it's not doing what we expect it to do, which is to give an impetus to SMEs to start up a business and to benefit employment and everything else in Portsmouth. So it's a kind of contradiction in terms. It's not up to the GANS to decide whether or not we proceed with the Hampshire Community Bank, but I'm not satisfied that it's as attractive a proposition as it seemed to be on the surface if you delve into it, because we're just, as I said earlier, being a shadow NatWest or TSB or whatever, and I don't think we are likely to have the expertise, even if Dr. Werner is in every single element of this and a finger in every single pie and is intelligent and all the rest of it. I just don't think that we have the necessary expertise to beat NatWest and others at their own game, is all I can say, because that's what we're trying to play, as opposed to being a community bank, which is what I thought we were trying to be.
Chairman, you have a difficulty in really making much progress here today on this particular item. You asked for an update report, which you have. You're being asked to note the report. It's not, of course, this committee's decision, as Councillor Lamb rightly said, whether or not this proceeds. So I would suggest that all you can do at the moment we will record the observations and concerns which have been raised, and they will go into the minutes. And then it's a matter to try to bring to the attention as individuals with Cabinet, for Cabinet to decide what it wants to do.
I think we should record that we note it, but we note it alongside a number of very serious concerns about the governance and potential operation of this entity. Right. We come now to agenda item 8, which is the Audit Performance Status Report. Chief Internal Auditor, your moment of glory.
Thank you, Chair.
Indeed.
In actual fact, I'd like to give an apology because there's a couple of factual inaccuracies in this report.
Is that an auditor?
Yes, and I take full responsibility because it was me that pulled together the majority of the information. If I can take you at the moment just to make the amendments to Appendix A, we had promised you that we would put in the dates of the actions. I take full responsibility because I did not include them in this particular report. So if I can actually just run through in relation to children's residential units, the completion date will be June 18. I know we've passed, but the report was issued earlier on in the year. Registrars, the end completion date is October 2018. Purchase cards, August 18. Land charges, October 18. Contaminated land, December 18. And city twinning is October 18. I will make sure that my colleague to the right of me checks any of my reports in future and may be able to pick that up before it gets submitted.
Fortunately, you do say twinning, but earlier in the... Someone called it twining, which I thought was quite interesting.
The other amendment to make to the report is under point 5.3. So for the February dates in the expected reporting period, obviously it is not 18, it should be 19.
And also for the March ones.
And for the March ones, yes. So February, March would all be a 19, not 18. So apologies, and as I said, all down to me. I think it's probably age. We report to you, obviously, on where we are in relation to the plan. I have included a couple of pie charts to try and demonstrate, obviously, where we are in relation to the completion of the plan. We have no criticals to raise to your attention this time round. We have no assurance to raise this time round. Obviously, throughout the year, if we do, we will bring those to your attention. You had asked whether we could include in here where we're spending the time, which I will come on to in a minute. But under section 5.2, on the areas where we have performed a follow-up, there were concerns that I raised in the annual audit opinion regarding the percentage of actions that hadn't been implemented, which was quite worrying because obviously there was a drop. You can see from the results that we have in the pie chart, obviously there is 64% of those that we've looked at to date that have been closed and they've been verified as being closed. The first one in relation to marketing and tourism, where it's got closed, no longer applicable, I think we will go back and make an amendment. In actual fact, when we concluded the audit, the original audit, that action had already been implemented. So we probably need to move it across to the closed verified. Paul will talk you through in a minute regarding the help desk, where when we've come to do the follow-up, the closed management action is that they are accepting the risk, to give you a little bit of narrative, and maybe it will be helpful that when we have any of those, we give you the narrative included in the report. And he will also give you some information around the parking spaces and garage management, why they haven't implemented and they're still in progress, i.e. they've started the actions. If you're happy with what information has been included in the first couple of pages, we will continue down that particular path. You'd also asked for clarity around the MMD plan with what we were starting, and we've pulled forward a number of those reviews, so you can see that the recruitment is currently in draft, and that would have been a follow-up from previous year. The payroll is currently in field work, and health and safety and gifts and hospitality is in its planning stages, but the planning memorandums should go out. It's sometimes tight to close down for the reporting period, which is why I've put down February. If we can get any reports to you before then, we will obviously do so as we go through. I'd already indicated that we were to give you some information around where we were spending our time and our days. We have not been fully resourced until recently, and John's narrative earlier regarding our sickness, unfortunately since reporting we have had some sickness. We've got a planned operation within the team, and we have a couple of pregnancies within the team, which I need to resource moving forward. So things have been reasonably contained, but I will need to look at that. But I will need to look at that moving forward. So I'm happy to take any comments. What isn't included within the resource is internal audit do undertake a number of activities that are not strictly of an audit nature. A lot of those are already noted in the ongoing areas. So we have a statutory role, but I've taken out of the equation of the 2,000 days some of the provisions that we have to make for roles that aren't normally contained within but sit very nicely within audit. So, for example, the Regulation of Investigation Powers Act, I'm one of 2 authorising officers, and I'm responsible for the policy and for the training. Anti-money laundering isn't strictly an audit requirement, but it sits very nicely. The financial rules waiver, it makes sense audit are involved, in that we have an opinion on the control and the risk assessment. The National Fraud Initiative, again, is something that sits within audit, but it's not necessarily an audit requirement for us to do. So I've tried to make provisions for what isn't a statutory function. I think everything else is pretty self-explanatory, so I am happy to take any and all comments, but maybe Paul can just give you the discussion around those 2 areas of the follow-up.
Yeah, so the risk that was accepted under the City Help Desk was around system access. So the help desk staff can obviously access a large number of systems to help people when they phone up. The issue we raised was that they probably had a bit too much access in relation to one of the social care systems. They could... Oh, sorry, that would be under 5.2. And the closed management accepts risks under the City Help Desk. It's in the table on probably on the previous page. So the risk there was that they could probably access more information they needed to. So they looked into the system, but the system was not able to set up an access where they could see the front screen which they needed but not go any further. But the system is audited regularly, so we run regular reports to see what people have been accessing in relation to records, and there was no concerns raised in relation to that. We took the issue also to the corporate governance group and explained the situation. They were also happy that the risk was accepted at the time because the system could not provide the functionality that ideally it would want to. However, they are changing systems, as you heard earlier, to System 1, and that is one of the requirements they are looking to build into that. Also, on the parking space and garage management, you'll note that 4 of the 5 exceptions were started, so that means they'd been started but weren't finished. The reasons behind that were that they were changes in processes that they needed to implement across the various housing sites. So the different housing offices all obviously have parking spaces and garages, so it was a case of implementing those new processes across multiple sites. It hadn't been fully implemented when we'd done the testing, and the management there has then requested that they are having regular updates from those various sites to make sure that those new processes are now fully implemented going forward.
On the City Help Desk, the system lacks its functionality. Does this have a risk for the data protection regulation?
Not that I'm aware. We haven't had any breaches, and the auditing does take place on a regular, so there's a random audit selection that IT undertake, and they verify that the records that are being accessed, there is a reason to access them. As far as I'm aware, I don't think Michael could correct me if needs be, but we haven't had any data breaches in relation to that system. So there is controls in place to mitigate the risk somewhat.
Sorry, momentary, I thought that when you talked about counter-fraud programme, I thought you were talking about the counter downstairs and the help desk, but because I think, anyway, it doesn't matter, I'm sure it's spelled differently, or it's got a hyphen. Though I'm fascinated that we have that the tail seems to be wagging the dog all the time when it comes to programmes that we have. That it must be possible to put a password just behind the top layer of anything. You can write an API in about 10 minutes to do something like that. It doesn't need... I mean, I'm staggered that we don't go outside and look at the things that we want to get done without going through the whole process of changing complete programmes and simply say, can we write an API? Can we get this particular programme to talk to another programme? It's standard practice in the industry, but that it just seems to me, time and again, people say, no, it can't be done. That is the standard answer, and we say, okay, we'll just do something else then. It cannot be right. The IT is one of the most versatile, able parts of our economy, and every time Portsmouth gets up against something that's problematic, something comes back and says, it can't be done. So we just say, all right, then we'll just do something else. I'm amazed. Sorry, Lindsay, I know you're champing at the bit to tell me I'm wrong.
Councillor, I don't think we would disagree with you in any capacity, but in relation to that particular issue, I think we are satisfied that whilst it's not the ideal solution, because they are changing the systems, they can factor it in. But we wouldn't disagree with you at all. It shouldn't be rocket science, it should be a standard thing.
Can we therefore be... can you get an assurance that this will be written in when these changes take place?
Otherwise, can I say how much I appreciate the report? Its brevity is breathtaking, and I looked at the end things. I was interested in that. I think we've had purchase cards as a point before, haven't we? I mean, this is an old chestnut that seems constantly not to deliver. So not something that you can roast properly, possibly apart from the direct.
The purchase cards, you're right. What we do need to put into context is the reason we look at it on an annual basis is the volume of purchase card holders that we have across the authority is quite high because there is a business need, the level of transactions, and because there is always within something of that nature the ability to misspend, buy the wrong thing, not code it correctly. So we do look at it at on a regular basis for you. Some of the issues I think you will always have because it's about the human intervention. But yeah, we will continue to work and to raise with the various directors when there is a particular issue to bottom out whether it is a training issue or whether there is anything that is a little bit more willful for non-compliance. But we will look at it for you on a regular basis because I think we need to, because there are a number of high risks around it.
Can I just ask a question again? This is something that I would see more likely to happen in the private sector, which is that those who are trusted with the council's money in the form of a plastic card are presumably generally at a level where they would qualify for their own credit card. Why is it that they can't pay with their own credit card and we agree to pay them back before their credit card is due to be paid? Why do we think that it's sensible to allow people to have access straight into our bank account, which is a lot larger, I suspect, than anybody working for it, rather than to have a system that they, I mean, within reason. I'm talking about, okay, if it's over £100 or if it's over an amount that you wouldn't reasonably expect someone to have to pay out from their own resources, I've always believed it's easier for us to get people to claim back rather than just for them to ask permission rather than, or ask forgiveness rather than ask permission. I mean, effectively, that's what we should be doing, and I don't understand for the life of me why we don't pursue that particular procedure.
Mr. Lawther.
We've done a lot of work around this. First of all, there are very strict limits put on these cards, these purchase cards. For instance, people can't withdraw cash. The limit will be very, very low, which they could actually charge against. And some people it will be higher depending upon their business need. But the work which we have done does show that it's much, much more efficient, apart from the few infringements which do take place, to deal with it in this way. Having to recover and repay people is an inefficient use of resources. It is quite an expensive thing to do. It is. We have done the work. We're pretty confident that this is the most efficient way to use the Council's resources.
So how many people have access to the cards?
We'll double check, but off the top of my head, it's in the region of, what, 850, I think?
What? Yeah. So we employ 3,400 people, and what you're saying is a quarter of them have access to payment cards.
To payment cards. We'll get confirmation, because we'll see.
There are very, very, very few problems with the number of transactions which take place. We mustn't get this out of proportion.
Michael, I completely understand that, but there used to be a time, I mean, rather like when we weren't in the EEC, but obviously not being in the future, one of the things could be disaster, but there was a time when plastic payment cards didn't exist. So how did we operate? I mean, you know,
much more inefficiently. We can provide with information. We have really done a lot of work in this. This is not somewhere we want to turn back the clock.
No, I understand that, but this, as I say, is a Governance and Audit Standards Committee meeting. So I think it's valid to ask the question, and just to say it's not as good as it was, or it's better doing this way, is not, to me, it's a bit like a child saying, why can't I do that because, is the answer.
Could I just provide a little bit of context on them, because it's not under my management sphere now, but it was when they were introduced and in the early stages of development. It is really important to stress that these are not sort of company credit cards in the way that you might use in private sector firms. They are purchasing cards, and the point of them is essentially to greatly simplify and ease and speed up the process of procuring goods. So by and large, they're not being used by people sort of paying restaurant bills and hotel bills. There are large numbers of people who have them. Most of those are either administrative staff, because they're using them to buy stationery, stuff like that, which they would otherwise have to raise a purchase order for, wait for it to come in, goods received, pay invoices, do all that sort of stuff, which, as Mr. Laws has explained, is bureaucratically cumbersome and much easier with a purchasing card. Quite a lot of them are actually held in areas like social care, where you're dealing with people who have, in effect, sort of personal support accounts for client groups, and they're having to use them sort of to buy items which they're purchasing for the clients in the course of their duty, because of the way that the financial arrangements are set up with support packages, etc. So I mean, there are a large number of people having the cards, but these are not, and I would really be very, very keen to steer members away, and members of the public who might be sort of watching this, from the notion that these are cards being held by sort of executives going around sort of using them to buy dinners, etc. That is absolutely not what they are. They are purchasing cards, procurement cards, to treated differently, to purchase items which would otherwise have had to go through a process of raising purchase orders, paying invoices, all those kind of things. As Mr. Law said, they are subject to a lot of scrutiny, so there are a number of staff, for example, in my own department who have them. I have to approve their statements on a very regular basis, and I see every single item that's gone through there, and the responsibility is on me as the approving manager within my remit to sign those off. They've been subject to a lot of scrutiny in the past by members. Literally had members sort of sat in a procurement team going through sort of sheets of statements trying to find sort of rogue items that might suggest they've been inappropriately used and not been able to identify them. But I think it's absolutely right, as Lizzie said, that they are subject to regular audit, because clearly it is an area of risk where there is the potential for misuse if that's not properly sort of scrutinised and make sure the processes around them aren't correct. But I think it's really because it is something that would be easy for people who are less familiar with the process to sort of get the wrong end of the stick about, if you like. And I was just really keen to emphasise to members what purchasing cards are, what they're for, and why they're widely used in the organisation.
I'm sorry, I don't have an issue with faster, speedier payment systems, but if you get the statement and you look through the statement yourself, why doesn't the member of staff come to you and say, can you go and buy it for me? Why do you have to do that later? I mean, I don't understand the process. If you're saying to me that they found themselves on their own in an office with nobody else who had an ability to authorise a payment was around, and this happened frequently, first of all, I ask why the office is so badly attended, but second, as a director of companies, I don't allow my staff to make purchases except through a purchasing process. Now, I agree that we are a big organisation here, but I would never give a payment card, apart from possibly the social services side, to anyone under assistant director level, because if they can't go and ask permission to do it, because your problem is actually you're saying, oh, going through procurement is going to be too difficult, because you're going to ask Greg or something, Greg Pavey, and he's going to come back and it's going to take ages to do that. I want somebody to have a permission system that says, we need to buy a stapler because we haven't got one and there's nothing in supplies, can we do that? And somebody says, yes, then, rather than forgiveness afterwards by saying, oh, yes, well, I've just looked through your list and this is what you bought.
But
surely
there isn't a problem. There isn't a problem with their use. That's what the audit overall is showing. The audit is showing, the regular audits we undertake show that there isn't a great difficulty with their use.
Okay, are you telling, so how much money goes through these cards every year? Have there been no fraud ever? And has anyone ever been dismissed for misuse of cards? And if so, how many people?
Okay, Councillor A, there is 747 that currently have cards. The expenditure is approximately 3.7 million. Now, if anybody has been identified and there has been abuse, it would have come through audit because we would have undertaken the investigation. Now, I cannot recall any, certainly in the last 3 years. There is greater transparency because how this particularly works is we have one provider and everything is electronic. So from an audit perspective, because
when you say one provider, what do you mean?
We have one provider that provides all of the credit cards for us. And that one provider gives us...
That's not debit card.
Purchasing cards. Well,
so they're not debit, they don't go straight into the bank account, so they're not debit cards as such, they're credit cards.
There is a limit set. There are approximately 2 or 3 people that have a limit that is in the region of about 10,000, and that is because they need to in relation to civil contingency. Most of the other levels are between 500 and perhaps 2,000, but generally between 500 and 1,000. There's greater transparency because the provider, we can actually do an extract, and so can relevant managers, to see who has purchased what and what the nature of that expenditure is. We could never do that under the old system where an individual would go along, submit a claim, because of the entries that were put on the accountancy system, whereas at least now you can go in and say, right, okay, and we look for trigger things. So we look for things like parking charge notices. to see whether anybody, we look for forbidden items, so we'll do a data extract on those. So there is greater transparency without a doubt, and it's definitely far more efficient because the old system was very, very manual. It's still responsibilities of management to obviously sign things off. The transactional level, there was about 37,000 transactions, which totaled, as I said, the 3.7 million. I have some offices in my section that have some purchase cards. I don't have a purchase card. Now, the nature of what they're using it for is probably train travel. Because we are ping-ponging about all over the place, and they will purchase things on behalf of other people within. So I have knowledge, and I should, as a manager, have rough knowledge of what I expect to come through, where it's coded, and having a look at the VAT. So it works an awful lot more efficient.
I find myself persuaded, but the point is what we've just done is a proper governance and audit process of asking questions about something we don't know very much about, getting proper answers that give us confidence. So we now know that 747 people have got cars. They spent 3.7 million, so they've spent on average £500 a year, and obviously some have spent more and some have spent less. And the fact that internal audit isn't terribly worried about it. The city solicitor would go absolutely ape if we didn't have them. and head of HR is sort of just looking kind of askance and hoping that we're not going to make a recommendation adversely. But we have just done a governance and audit event. That's what we're here for. And for you to come back and tell us and give us assurance that it's actually the right thing to do allows us to ask questions rather than going, it's almost to say why we're entitled to ask those questions. We are entitled to ask those questions because we're sitting this side of the room and we are ultimately responsible for what you do. And this is exactly what we're here to do. And so I'm actually pleased that we've been through this process. It demonstrates that those in the public who've sat around for long enough to listen and see that that's what it's about. I don't need people to go, God, if we tell them this, they're going to do that, because actually we're just going to ask the questions, and if you come up with perfectly good answers, then the answer is going to be fine, let's go ahead with it. But we're entitled to ask the question.
Do you mind if I just add two final bits? One is there was a change, and Jules might be able to help me out with when the change was implemented. When purchase cards, we've had purchase cards for quite a few years, but there was a real drive that anything below £500 had to go through the purchase card route because that's when the assessment and the business case was around it. Now, I can't quite remember what it is, but it is written within our rules now, isn't it, that anything below that should definitely go via purchase card. And there will always be risks, but the system is generally... So I can't hand on heart say we'll never have a fraud.
To the argument because of the, that's fine. And Michael says, don't say anything more.
On that, we'll move on to Michael's great performance. Data security breaches. Agenda item 9.
Right, pleased to bring you this report. Obviously, since GDPR has been brought in, our obligation to report data breaches has been somewhat increased. We have to report all data breaches within 72 hours. There's 28 concerns which are on this list. These come through myself and Helen Magri. We will occasions also take them through our information governance group for their consideration so that we get across the organisation, which is a group drawn from all of the services in the organisation, so people's got increased awareness of what amounts to a data breach and what items should and should not be reported. But we had 28 concerns which are raised. These have all been looked at. We have an agreed protocol and procedure, and we take into account the ICO's guidance when deciding whether or not to report them. 3 were reported. 1, we've got no further action from the ICO, and 2 are still under consideration. At the moment, if we were to say that what is the learning from this, what are the trends which we are discovering, it's unfortunately the continuing trend which we have, which is that an awful lot of the breaches result from human error. There have been some unfortunate occasions where there's one example there, a mobile phone was stolen during a house burglary. Not a problem at all. Wouldn't be a problem if one of our laptops was stolen or an encrypted hard disk, because we have the ability to be able to deal with these remotely. We can wipe them and so forth. But on the whole, it's ongoing. It's the same problem. We need to continue to educate staff to make sure that they do things in the right way at the right time. We don't get particular problems. And we will continue to look to see if there's any improvements which we can make to our procedures to avoid problems arising where information is inadvertently sent to the wrong person, because that is an ongoing problem. Emails being misdirected, letters being sent to the wrong person. Occasionally we are getting information where people have passed on information which they shouldn't do, and we then need to sit down with the staff member and find out why that happened and remind them that they shouldn't be doing it. My advice continues to be, as the council solicitor, in any situation where it is clear that, and there isn't any examples here, where it's clear that the breach was intentional, somebody accessed a record or passed on information which they shouldn't do, disciplinary proceedings must follow, and in those circumstances we will consider everything up to including dismissal on each and every occasion.
I brought up this subject 2 meetings ago. You weren't at the last one, but this happened in Gosport, where I believe you are monitoring officer. An employee in housing benefit, told her mother about somebody else's situation in some detail, and her mother confronted this person, and this person has now been told there's no further action. It wasn't a serious breach. Now, does that mean that you actually saw it and you came to that decision, or you didn't? And if it happened in Portsmouth, which is where we are now,
yeah, I'm happy to deal with Portsmouth. I think
I'm just saying if this happened in but it doesn't matter. But I'm just saying if it happened in Portsmouth and an employee told a member of her family about somebody they both knew, because she had privileged information about it, and it got back to that person and they complained, would we send it to the Information Commissioner?
I think we most probably would be in those circumstances. We'd certainly then be considering what action to take against the employee as well. If there's an intentional breach, that is not acceptable.
With you privately on the.
In all of these, has any action been taken against the employee who was in error, or is this a matter merely where advice has been given?
I will find out if any action has been taken. I don't know that today, but I will let you know, and I'll let you know in which particular cases that would be. So, but certainly each and every member of staff would have been given advice. Staff are extremely concerned. It causes people quite a lot of distress when they discover they have done something wrong, because they know that they want to do things right first and foremost. And secondly, they know there is the possibility that it may impact upon their employment. But people, on the whole, that's not the concern. The concern is that they want to get things right. And we want to encourage a culture where people will tell us when they make mistakes, because we really need to know so we can try to remedy the problem.
The only one that worries me or concerns me, of course, is not something we don't have control over. The child's care plan sent to the wrong family, and we think the documents have actually been uploaded to Facebook, which is just appalling.
If a breach occurs,
what remedy is there available for that?
Well, the person who's uploaded the information as well is committing an offence. They shouldn't be doing that, and that's a matter then for the ICO to consider. The ICO will prosecute in those circumstances. Will consider prosecution. It's the ICO's decision whether or not to prosecute. And they will go to the person who has suffered potential damage as a consequence, whose data has been released, and ask them whether or not they want the prosecution to proceed. So they will, upon occasion, when it has been the council's information which has been provided inappropriately by a staff or former staff member, the ICO has come back to us and asked us whether or not we want to prosecute, and the answer is almost inevitably yes. So in the circumstances such as that, they would go to the service user and they would say to them, do you wish us to prosecute? So it's in their hands.
We would presume to prosecute, provided that the person who's the victim, for the want of a better word, wants to pursue it too. But if he or she didn't,
no, it's two separate matters. If it's information which Give you a hypothetical situation. If a staff member was to access a system, we're the data control of that system, and they were then to misuse that information, we would be in circumstances where the ICO would come to us and ask us whether or not we wished prosecution to proceed. That would be the case. In this instance here, I think they would go to the individual whose data had been breached and ask them whether or not it was.
In this case, because it doesn't tell us whether or not we actually think that, we don't think it was deliberate on behalf of the council to send this care plan to the wrong family. So that's a mistake, and we may, as a council, suffer. We could, in theory, be fined for it or something by the Information Commissioner. That having been said, do we have any, rather like the question earlier about giving compensation, do we have any idea about how much, in terms of fines, we might be due to pay for these 3 incidents, or not, as the case may be, and would it not be sensible to tell us?
The ICO can issue fines up to 20 million euros. We have never been fined.
Fined at all?
Under this regime, the previous regime, we have never suffered a fine.
Right. That's
which is a good sign.
That's new GDPR.
Prior to GDPR as well, the ICO was known to give out quite substantial fines. A number of local authorities, I can think of at least 2 in Hampshire, who have been fined 6-figure sums, and we certainly haven't been. And that's because we take our roles and responsibilities very seriously.
Thank you, which just leaves item 10. The committee is asked to consider whether it wishes to disapply the political balance rules in respect of its subcommittees which consider complaints against members, and to agree that the same rules shall apply to the initial filtering process. I propose that from the chair. Do you agree? It is unanimous amongst the members who are here present. That concludes the meeting.
Well, there is actually the final point in the agenda, which is a point of noting, sorry, Chairman. Yep. Which is this SNP thing. I've never been to a meeting before where there's an item on the agenda which doesn't actually happen. Item 11 is scrutiny update. And it says the Scrutiny Management Panel Chair has been notified of the comments made by the Committee in respect to the role of scrutiny, and he will circulate the note in respect to the points raised. But there's no question of noting it. In fact, we couldn't, because we've only received that yesterday. What I would like to make, if I may, through you, Chairman, is it's an important enough subject raised at the last meeting about what the Governance and Audit and Standards Committee is supposed to be able to reassure anybody, particularly a government inspector, that we are doing our job, that the SMP, as part of it, is supposed to scrutinise properly the policy decisions, the decisions, not just what we might think is around the corner, monorails and goodness knows what else, of the Cabinet through the Scrutiny Management Panel, and we don't do it. Now, I know that Tom Wood has written to us about it, but I think we need to make a point that at the next meeting, this needs to be discussed. Whatever we've done, whatever happens, we need to discuss it. Now, he's kindly coming back and saying he's going to talk to us about it or give us some kind of note at some point. So he said, in the meantime, thank you very much for highlighting this important issue, and I will let committee members know when this matter is formally coming before the Scrutiny Management Panel, in case anyone wishes to attend or indeed watch it on the Council web stream. I can't imagine a more riveting thing to do. I spend an afternoon.
Okay.
But I don't want this to bounce back between 2 committees. Now, the interesting thing is I'm on, and as are you, on the Scrutiny Management Panel, so we are actually keen to make, and so I think it's Simon Bosher, Councillor Simon Bosher, and I wonder whether Councillor Ferret is, I don't know whether he is or not, but 3 of the members of this committee are on that. And I think we need to make sure it doesn't bounce backwards and forwards on some kind of rubber ball system. But thank you very much, Chairman.
That concludes this morning's and this afternoon's entertainment.